Welcome to the Pro-Black Perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions. Your host tonight is the author of the Pro-Black Compendium and Zuberi and the Maroons of Ma'at, the Pan-African nationalist, Oni. Oni, what are we discussing tonight?
All right, peace, family. We're on chapter 3 of Consciencism. I'm going to tell you the truth, though, right now. I looked at chapter 5. It looks like a really complicated chapter. So, so I'm not 100% sure you're going to hear chapter 5 from me. But I also decided, I'll tell you guys, this is November 4th. I decided, look, you know what? This is 5 episodes. It might be a little too long to do it once a week. Because, you know, I know people who are like, who want to read this book, and they want to hear it all. So I'm probably, like, you are going to know before I do, I guess. But I'm probably going to just release maybe the first 4 episodes on Sunday, right? And then the last 5th episode, I could stream live on, I could stream premiere on the next Sunday. So, you know, pretty much you're going to get the gist of the whole book, and maybe if you're really interested, you can come watch it live with me. But of course, that chapter seems so complicated that a part of me is thinking to myself, yeah, maybe I won't. You know, like maybe I won't even do it at all because, like, there's nothing that I could, like, I don't know. I will see. But as far as that's concerned, yeah, we're at Consciencism. I don't know how to say this word. I don't care to say it. You know, it's missing some sort of sound. You know, sometimes you got to just hear a word, and it's just such a unique word. I mean, it comes from conscience, obviously, but then he replaces the E with the ISM, so it's just a little bit harder to say. Before we get into it, though, just a little bit of housekeeping, as the Bit of Medicine podcast would say. I think he says it. Oh.
This is D Webb with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Greetings, everyone. This is Koku from the Bit of Medicine podcast, inviting you to tune in to the Bit of Medicine podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Greetings, fam. Tune in to The Learning Curve with me, the revolutionary matron on KWAZ Radio.
You are listening to the Pro-Black Perspective on KWAZ Radio.
That feeling when you accidentally press a button and then you're like, well, I guess that's what I was going to do anyway. But yeah, you know, appreciate you guys for listening. Appreciate you for listening. Definitely, you know, subscribe, like, whatever. Like I said, if you ever like any of these explanations, send $1. Send $1. Or, you know, if you're not going to send $1 directly, just make a mark. And if you get to the 50th mark, you say, hey, you know what? I'm going to get me a copy of the Book of Power. You know, if you don't already have one. And if you do already have one, just get a copy for somebody you know and trust. That's really what it is. Because, you know, at the end of the day, it's really about us moving our products in a sense, or moving our services, or just supporting each other. Because the reality is this: what we want for Africa is not going to come about unless we make it come about. You know, I told you I went to Ghana. I went to Nkrumah's country, and there are people there who are very idle. Now, not everybody's idle, of course not, but the point is that when I say somebody's idle, I want you to understand that that's a problem. And what is the difference between being idle and not being idle is supporting the other people who you want to see being active. Because I'll be honest, I could be idle too. You know what I mean? Like idle life doesn't seem that bad, and it's actually pretty affordable for somebody in America to be idle in Africa, right? I don't want to be idle. But at the same time, I need to know what is it that, like, I need to, yeah, you get what I'm saying. So let's go into chapter 3, though, because, you know, you want to know about this book, and I want to know about it, too. All right, so he says, in the last chapter, I tried to show and confirm by test cases that philosophy always arose from a social milieu, and that a social contention is always present in either explicitly or implicitly. Social milieu affects the content of philosophy, and the content of philosophy seeks to affect social milieu, either by confirming it or by opposing it. double check that my audio is heard. Good. In either case, philosophy implies something of the nature of an ideology. In the case where the philosophy confirms a social milieu, it implies something of the ideology of that society. In the other case in which philosophy opposes a social milieu, it implies something of the ideology or revolution against the social milieu. Philosophy in its social aspect can therefore be regarded as pointing up an ideology. So, of course, he's just saying how important, like he first shows you last chapter, how important. Sorry, did he say chapter? Okay, I thought it was parts. Okay, yeah. So what he did show in last chapter how philosophy is connected to the social milieu, right? And of course, this also could be seen as a selective bias because there's obviously going to be some philosophies that are not connected to the social milieu. But notwithstanding, what's important for Nkrumah or for us is that we discuss the philosophies that are involved in the social milieu, right? And in so much as we are involved in those, we realize that some philosophies defend the ideology, the recurring ideology, and some go against it, and that's what would be the ideology of revolution and so on and so forth. So let's go back to this. So he says, on the model page of my book, Towards Colonial Freedom, I make the following quotation from Mazzini. Every true revolution is a program and derives from a new, general, positive, and organic principle. The first thing necessary is to accept that principle. Its development must then be confined to men who are believers in it and emancipated from every tie or connection with any principle of an opposite nature. That's actually, now this is not Nkrumah, but, again, when we're talking about forming revolutions, or even let me say it this way, for me personally, this is why what I try to do in my literature is also different or distinct, is that, I say, Boko Waset Nakedo, right? And that's what it is that you're supposed to do. Now, what I will add to my idea versus what Mazzini was saying is that, what Mazzini is saying is this too, to be more firm and to say, look, you have to be emancipated from every tie or connection with any principle of an opposite nature. And that's something that we don't do. I'll say this, right? When we talk about quote unquote black liberation or whatever, right? We kind of just attach to everybody, even if they're opposing each other. We're like, hey, you know what? Dr. King, we got Dr. King. Or even if you don't know Dr. King, you're like, we got a Nation of Islam. And we got this organization. We got that organization. We got the All African People's Revolutionary Party. We got UNIA. We got so forth. Even when these guys are not, when these guys have opposing principles, right? We still whatever, just do anything. That is actually, and when I say whatever, just do anything, I'm referring to what Kwame Nkrumah says. Kwame Nkrumah would tell you, and he's a socialist, and he's, no, sorry, not Kwame Nkrumah, sorry, Kwame Ture, right? He's a socialist, and he even named himself after the brother right here, Kwame Nkrumah, right? But what Kwame Ture is like, yeah, it doesn't matter what you do, just be in an organization. And the reality is that, no, if you're really serious about what your group is about, then you should emancipate people from the other organizations, but also, you should tell people no, not those organizations, and that's something that I get critiqued for, because it's like, why would you, so on and so forth. And a lot of times we always say the same thing. We're like, hey, everybody's going in the same direction anyway, blah blah blah. But realistically speaking, no, you have to be firmly. It's like the capitalist is firmly capitalist. He's not communist at all. And here's the thing too. If you were to say, well, yeah, but he allows for different versions of capitalism. Not really. The Singapore version of capitalism versus the Taiwanese version of capitalism versus the American version of capitalism versus the British, they're all distinct and different, and they do not support one another. In fact, I could even point out that the American version of capitalism, the really firm American capitalists, do not like they say that the Swedish model is disappointing, or the British model is depressing, or they're really opposed to the other models in the Western European countries. It's what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to so I actually, of course this is Mazzini, he's a white boy, so I try not to agree with white boys, but just because Kwame Nkrumah put him forward, I'm just explaining to you what it means, right? All right. let's go. Here, Mazzini asserts the connection between a revolution and an ideology. When the revolution has been successful, the ideology comes to characterize the society. It is the ideology which gives a countenance to the ensuing social milieu. Mazzini further states the principle to be general, positive, and organic. The statement, elucidation, and theoretical offense of such a principle will collectively form a philosophy. Hence, philosophy admits of being an instrument of ideology. Indeed, it can be said that in every society there is to be found an ideology. In every society there is at least one militant segment, which is the dominant segment of that society. Interesting, right? So he's like, now that's a pretty interesting statement to say, that not only is there an ideology everywhere, but in every society there is at least one militant segment, which is also the dominant segment of the society, which is to say that every society is controlled by a militant segment. Now, some of you might think, well, is he talking about the police or is he talking about the military, right? So that's hopefully he's going to expound on that. But, like you could also just be like, yes, and if not even the military or the police, you could say, hey, look, the politicians in a sense, right? But anyway, in the communalistic societies, this segment coincides with the whole. This dominant segment has its fundamental principles, its beliefs about the nature of man and the type of society which must be created for man. Its fundamental principles help in designing and controlling the type of organization which the dominant segment uses. And the same principle gives rise to a network of purposes which fix what compromise are possible or not possible. One can compromise over program, but not over principle. Any compromise over principle is the same as an abandonment of it. She says, and the same principle. All right, sorry. So I was just a little bit distracted because I was wondering why he was going to talk when he was going to talk about militant group, and I was, my mind was like, well, what does he mean by militant group? But that's one of the things about reading live is that usually when you're reading, you want to, just chew on some of the information, but you can't really chew on it and read at the same time, because you just hear my voice, but you won't know that I'm actually chewing on something. Because I'm just wondering, like when he says militant segment of every society, it's like you also consider the older communities, like the, I always name these groups, right? But like, just like are the Hutu or the Tutsi or something, right? Or you think of older groups than that. I can't remember the names of them, but there are some groups with like large age grades, large this, so on and so forth. And the question being, were these groups dominated by the militant segments of them? Is it the case that every society, because that's what he writes, every society is dominated by the militant segment, or is it the case that Western societies are dominated by militant segments? Is it the case that the Ashanti or the Zulu? I mean, obviously the Zulu, right? But there's so many groups, but I haven't been to college for like 10 years, for a decade. So I took, African history course, but I don't remember all the names. Like we had like, there was this one group that I really liked. And had this large age grade, and they were like considered very peaceful. They had no standing army. They would just recruit, so on and so forth. If I was doing live, you guys probably in the comment and be like, oh, these people. Oh, maybe the Shona. There you go. See, somebody. You gotta just pretend that there's a comment section and be like Shona. Yeah, but like Shona is an example of that. And then of course you could spread out even further. Another example could probably be the like we just had the Hedzabe, and we had the Himba in another book. Inside of the other podcast, and they don't necessarily have militant segments per se. I mean, the Himba probably you say the men. Were they the militant men? I it's hard to tell, but again, it's not like a segment per se as much as it's half the population, right? Right? And then with the Hedzabe, it's like maybe they all like they were just hunters. So were they all militant? Were they not militant? Like, what does that even mean? So it's actually a pretty like I don't know if he just generalized overgeneralized there, and it just got me thinking. But again, like a part of what we picked up from this book is that it is kind of steeped in Westernism, and when you're steeped in Westernism, you can kind of get into the habit of universalism, and in that habit of universalism, it could eventually become a mistranslation. Like you want to look into the West as it is, sure, but you have to also say to yourself, well, look, I'm still in the West as I'm talking about this stuff, And this is like comes from. I want to go back just a little bit more to one of the experiences I had back in university, where actually that same African history course we would read Ibn Battuta in Black Africa, and this was actually it was like a decade ago, right, when I was like in college. This is also the time I was reading Western philosophies. Like I was reading a European like European philosophy or something like that, just casually, and wait, maybe I might have read it a little later. But the thing that was really stuck out to me was that there was this Western philosopher who says, it's a part of human nature that if you're like in a park and you see a wallet, and you leave a wallet that's like you leave just a wallet on the bench, right? You come back a day later and it's gone, right? And it's gone not in the sense of somebody tried to give it to the owner. It's gone in the sense that somebody's going to steal it. And he's like, this is just a part of human nature. And it was interesting when you read Ibn Battuta's Black Africa, in the sense that these Europeans went to Ibn Battuta went to Africa, and he said that if you were to leave your purse on a bench in this certain African society, the Africans would pick it up and look for you, look for somebody that and say, hey, this person left their purse in this area. As to say that it was completely contrary to whatever the European philosopher who said it was. And it could be Hume, it could be Hobbes, it could be whomever. But the point being that it was just a different, like it was just a radically different nature. And of course, that back then I was like, whoa, wow, like we are just a moral people and so on and so forth. But I bring this all up just to point out that when you say, hey, every society is has at least one militant segment that is the dominant segment, right? It's like, is that necessarily the case? But anyway, but of course, I do go back to the Kemet model, like I told you guys about, and that hierarchy, that kingship, that monarchy, those societies with those hierarchies, with those monarchies, could be what he's also talking about in regards to dominant segment having a militant segment. But I mean, it's also like again, it's just complicated to say, because even if you go back into this book where we talk about the agricultural cultures of early Greece, where the priests were the dominant segment, right? Were they the militant segment? Anyway, so in communalistic segments, this segment coincides with the whole. So he's basically saying the militant segment and the dominant segment are the same, and they're the whole of the. That's not a segment; it's the whole of the community when in a communist society, right? This dominant segment has its fundamental principles, its beliefs about the nature of man and the type of society which must be created for man. Its fundamental principles help in designing and controlling the type of organization which the dominant segment uses. And the same principle gives rise to a network of purposes which fix what compromises are possible or not possible. One can compromise over program, but not over principle. Any compromise over principle is the same as an abandonment of it. So what he's just saying is that you have to, like, you could have different programs, but you can't have different principles, right? If you like, you have to be firm on your on your principles. Otherwise, that's where, like you already abandoned your ideology, and that's actually that's pretty interesting. Like let's say, again, I'm trying to, like, I'm divorced from America. I believe me, I am. But it's also pretty interesting because America is a country that I'm pretty informed about, right? Having lived there for 30-something years, right? Now, one thing I would say about that is, like, it's principally, the like, one of the two major events in American history is, and this is one thing that I almost put inside the Book of Power, in quoting Amos Wilson, but he surrounded it in religious dogma to the point where, for those of you who don't know, I don't really care for religious dogma too much, so I was just like, yeah, I can't even. But it was an interesting passage where he discusses like the actually, I think I might have put this in. I'm not too sure, but he discusses that America's history has two major events, which is, one, the killing of the Amerindian, right, the genocide of the Amerindian, and two, the enslavement of African people. And actually, I might be wrong. It might be Carlos Cooks who said this, so I'll just have to go review it again. But the idea is that these two major instances instances, what they did was like they were a part of a program and a part of the principle. And so now today, you know, the principle remains the same, even though the program changed. You know, so they're no longer killing the Native Americans, right? But principally, they have their land. Like, principally, they are going to keep their land, right? And then they're no longer enslaving, like, they're no longer not paying the African Americans, but principally, they're going to use their labor. That's a way to look at it as well. And of course, you know, you can also go to Africa and do what you, you know, and look at it however you want. But, you know, for what it's worth, you know, at least for Africa, I mean, a lot of us, you know, even Kwame Nkrumah himself would say, hey, you know, Africa's suffering from neocolonialism. And yes, of course, you know, Wazungu might have changed their program, but they didn't change their principles. And that principally, they still want your labor. Principally, they still want the resources from your land. Principally, right? Programmatically, how they get those resources might not be the same, but principally, they're going to remain the same. However, I think, you know, I'm going to give Nkrumah credit here, where I believe that we, on our own, also have to have our own principles, whether or not that program means whatever it means. So I think that's a pretty interesting thing. And it's also kind of consistent with us, you know, the thing I was talking about before about how we, inside of our revolutionary mindset, we kind of all go on different programs, but we tend to say that we have the same principles. Now, I don't believe we have the same principles, obviously, but we tend to say we have the same principles. So that's also something that's interesting. And, you know, like, again, I'm just really trying to exhaust the material so that, you know, moving forward, like, for one, you could understand the reading better, right? But two, so that we could understand each other better, you know? I know I said that weird. But we could understand each other better. And that's really, at the end of the day, and not just that. So, like, if we can understand each other better, then you and somebody else can also understand each other better. And that's really what this is all about, you know? It's not just your knowledge, but your social knowledge, you know? There's a story, it's called The Emperor Has No Clothes. No, sorry, I think it's like The Emperor Has No Clothes, something like that. Well, the motto is The Emperor Has No Clothes. And the idea is that, realistically speaking, you know, the way how information works, the way how knowledge works is that you want it to be social so that we can actually work together, you know? Because if you know something, like, for instance, you read this book and I read this book and we don't actually, you know, communicate what we understand or know about this book with each other, it really doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. But if we meet together as, hey, you know what, I know this, you know that, then we can actually build something together. It's kind of like the engineering thing, you know? If there's an engineer, this is a really proficient engineer over, you know, in town A, and it's a proficient engineer in town B, but they're just like, oh yeah, I'm the engineer or whatever, right? That's it. Like, they don't really work together. But if engineer A and engineer B communicate to each other that they know how to do the same thing for the same project and they just need an extra hand, then they can actually build something. So this is really what it's a part of. So, you know, because I can always just read it, obviously. You can always read it. Who cares? But we really, like let's be serious about this stuff, okay? So, all right, in societies where there are competing ideologies, it is still usual for one ideology to be dominant. This dominant ideology is that of the ruling group. Though the ideology is the key to the inward identity of its group, it is an intent solidaris. For an ideology does not seek merely to unite a section of the people, it seeks to unite the whole of society in which it finds itself. In its effect, it certainly reaches the whole of society when it is dominant. For besides seeking to establish common attitudes and purposes for the society, the dominant ideology is that which is, in the light of circumstances, decides what forms institutions shall take and in what channels the common effort is to be directed. You guys get that, you know, dominant ideology from the dominant ruling group, you know, so on and so forth. Just as there can be competing ideologies in the same society, so there can be opposing ideologies between different societies. However, while societies with different social systems can coexist, their added ideologies cannot. There is such a thing as peaceful coexistence between states with different social systems, but as long as oppressive classes exist, there can be no such thing as peaceful coexistence between opposing ideologies. So he's saying that, you know, you can't have peaceful coexistence between opposing ideologies. And this is why, you know, the if you will, the capitalists are going to oppress the communists. You know, a lot of times we're like, hey, why are you so outraged? We're just talking about or even like the black liberationists. They're like, oh yeah, why are you why are they, look, if it were, like we would say something like, if we weren't right, why would they arrest us? Blah, blah, blah. If we weren't a threat, why would they arrest us? And it's like, at the end of the day, they're going to arrest you because you're talking about destroying their society. You're openly discussing destroying their community. Like, you're openly discussing terrorism in a sense. And from as far as they're concerned, you're discussing terrorism. And you might be like, well, I should be free. Sure, they're like, yeah, you should be free, but not in my country, because my country is principally about exploiting your labor. And maybe you don't like me to exploit your labor, so then leave. But, like, I'm not going to have you in my nation not having your labor exploited. And to us, that matter-of-fact way I just said it might be like, hey, F you, Oni, right? By the way, I forgot to introduce myself. My name's Oni, right? But you might be like, hey, F you. That's so matter-of-fact. You're uncaring. Well, yeah, sure. But the point is that that's just the reality. The reality is that they have their principles, they have their program, and if you're not with it, then just leave. But if you, and you might be like, well, no, I'd rather fight them on their own ground. Yeah, okay, well then fight them. But the reality is that when you fight another group, they'll likely fight back. And if they're stronger than you, there's not much you could do. It's like the other day I saw this guy. He was like kind of like abusing his lady, or like they were like looking like they were gonna get into a fight, and so I kind of like stood near him, stood watch, but I wasn't sure if they were gonna get into a fight or not. But he was like, "Yeah, look, man, come try me," and he's this huge guy, so it's like I know that in the event of a fight, it's not gonna be easy. You know what I mean? like it's not gonna be easy. You don't know if he's armed or not. You don't know. But like, I can't be like, hey, I'm doing the right thing. Why am I getting hurt for it? That's just the real world is that whether you're doing the right thing or the wrong thing, you can get hurt. And that's just a calculus you have to do. If you're, like I said, I should leave America, but if you're 40% of the 12% of the population, for 12% of the population, and you go up against the 60% of the population, right? And they're armed and they're wealthy and they have industry and you don't, chances are that you're gonna be like, man, they killing us, like, yeah. What else are they gonna do? Like, what? You thought you were gonna be killing them? Like, come on. All right. So anyway, just better just freaking leave, bro. All right. Imperialism, which is the highest stage of capitalism, will continue to flourish in different forms as long as conditions permit it. Though its end is certain, it can only come about under pressure of nationalist awakening and an alliance of progressive forces which hasten its end and destroy its conditions of existence. It will end when there are no nations and peoples exploiting others, when there are no vested interests exploiting the earth, its fruits and resources for the benefit of a few against the well-being of the many. Now, here's what I want to point out to people. This is something that, like, I would take, I want you to understand. I would take, I don't know the word of it, but I don't know if I forget the word, but I will take issue, let's say, with this kind of a statement right here, where it says, it will end when there are no nations and people exploiting others, right? Basically, you're setting the bar too high, one of the, like you just don't want to set the bar too high. I mean, maybe this is his definitive answer, but in this kind of case where there are no nations and people's exploiting other, like, it's almost like it's not even possible. Now, this is why I kind of go about with the nationalist paradigm, where it's like, one, you could be free for yourself, where you could not be one of the exploited people, where you could just have like freedom in your own borders, and then from there expand your borders in a sense, right? But like the idea that, and then of course, also cut them away from a critical number of resources, right? Like you don't have to, like for instance, Rome didn't collapse because it had no more colonies, right? Rome collapsed because it lost enough colonies, or France didn't, take a back seat to, or Portugal didn't take a back seat to England because it had no colonies, right? Portugal took a back seat to England because of like a critical point was reached, whether it be, the sinking or for Spain, if, at least, the sinking of the Spanish Armada, or whether it was, loss of territory abroad, or what have you. Like, the reality is that you don't have to make it so absolute where it's like no nations and no people are being exploited, because, that's a little bit, like, that's just so absolute, because you could always have somebody in the middle of China, some Chinese village being exploited. Obviously that's not what he's talking about, but at the same time, that's why you want to, like, if you're going to say something like this, you want to put the conditions of victory less absolute, because there could be people who will, like, read it as you put it and be like, it's kind of like that, if there's a justice anywhere, there's an injustice everywhere, something like that. And it's like, no, not really. I couldn't care if somebody steals a purse in Belarus. You know what I mean? Or somebody, kidnaps I'm not gonna say I don't care about somebody kidnaps a grown man in Belarus, right? I'm not gonna say I don't care about kidnapping, but it's like that's not going to impact a real powerful African empire. It's not gonna be like, oh, there's injustice in the world because somebody stole somebody in Belarus. Like, if you have an African empire, you just don't even care. So I just want to put that out there. It might be a little bit too whatever, but I don't have too many opportunities to speak with you because you're not subscribed, right? No, but seriously, I don't have too many opportunities to speak with you. So, or even not speak on this matter. So it's just, you gotta take your opportunities, right? Anyway, so let's go. When I say that in every society there's at least one ideology, I do not thereby mean that in every society a fully articulated set of statements is to be found. In fact, it is not ideology alone which can be so pervasive and at the same time largely convert. In every society there is to be found a morality. This hardly means that there is an explicit set of statements defining the morality. Morality is a network of principles and rules for the guidance and appraisal of conduct. And upon these rules and principles we constantly fall back. It is they which give support to our moral decisions and opinions. Very often we are quite definite about the moral quality of an act, but even when we are so definite, we are not necessarily ready with the reasons for the decision or opinion. It is not to be inferred from any such readiness, however, that there are no such reasons. We share within the same society a body of moral principles and rules garnered from our own experience and that our forebears. The principles directing these experiences give us skill in forming moral opinions without our having to be articulate about the source of the judgment. So, you all know about that. Like, basically every society has morality, so on and so forth. Another example of a similar phenomenon can be found in Freud. Sigmund Freud believed that nothing was ever forgotten by the individual. He did not, through this imply that the individual consciously remembered everything. On the other hand, it is because the individual did not consciously remember everything that psychoanalysis was necessary as a probe into the subconscious and the unconscious. On the other hand, it is because nothing was really forgotten that psychoanalysis is possible at all, for everything is there for it to probe. Thus, according to Freud, all our experiences are stored up and they affect our overt behavior even if we have no conscious memory of the experiences themselves. Just as morality guides and seeks to connect the actions of millions of persons, so an ideology aims at uniting the actions of millions towards specific and definite goals, notwithstanding that an ideology can be largely implicit. I'm aware that in this usage I depart somewhat from the fashionable one. It is often thought that an ideology has to be a body of writing of one individual or a small group of individuals directed only at fundamental change in a society. This is an evident mistake. An ideology, even when it is revolutionary, does not merely express the wish that a present social order should be abolished. It seeks also to defend and maintain the new social order which it introduces. But while it is defending its own social order, it is still an ideology and the same. That is to say, an ideology can remain an ideology while defending an existing progressive society. Nor can that fact that some particular ideology is not explicit on paper prevent it from being one. What is crucial is not the paper, but the thought. I want to disagree a little bit, okay? I want to disagree a little bit, not with what I just read, but with what we saw earlier in regards to the millions, right? Because I'm just thinking about, like I said, I went to Ghana. It was beautiful. I'm thinking about that guy who was just sitting down, right? Like all day. He was sitting down all day. If you guys didn't hear, I have this podcast that I streamed earlier. Yeah, I streamed live earlier. So just check that out. Go back. It's like before I did this series. It was something like Observations in Africa or something, But yeah, I should have taken a picture of this guy. But he would just sit down on the side of the road in the shade. Just sit down for hours. Like legit, just sit down for hours. At one point, he did put up something in front of him that suggested maybe he was selling phone plans. I don't know. But like for the most part, he was just on a chair, and I would just walk by and wave at him, and he just waved back. But that's pretty much the gist of it. Like he was idle. Why I say this is to say that like it's not that everybody in the society is following some sort of ideology, and backtrack to like I said, I'm in advanced America. Not everybody is actively pursuing the capitalist agenda, the imperialist agenda. I would really restrict that ideology, in a sense, to the upper class. Now, maybe somebody could say, hey, isn't that what Kwame Nkrumah said earlier about the ideology really comes from the upper class? Yes, it is. Right? He did actually just say that. But again, I wouldn't even put it down to the millions. I would, or even the morality guys, the millions or whatever. But I wouldn't put so the ideology aims at uniting the actions of millions towards. Like, I don't think that there's I wouldn't put it that the capitalists want us all to behave like capitalists per se, or behave like imperialists per se, but that they do have the instruments so that we all participate in their economy. That's what I would say. That they do want us all to participate in their economy, but not necessarily to the degree that, or to the same extent that they participate in the economy. So they, as the owners of capital, they don't necessarily want us to be the owners of capital, but they do want us to be the labor for that capital. That's the distinction. Now you could look at it from that paradigm and say, well, that would be consistent with this ideology for the millions, in the sense that they want you to participate in their ideological framework as the lower echelon of that ideological framework. And if that were the case, then yeah. But I would also reason that, like there's two different ideologies there. That there's the I mean it's the same ideology, but it's a different aspect of the ideology, to the point where I wouldn't say that it's necessarily like I could see where you could say it's one ideology, but I could also see where you could say it's not one ideology. Like to be the laborer is not necessarily to be the capitalist per se, but it is to be a part of the capitalist economy. But also I do want to touch back onto what I was talking about before in that other podcast on the African culture. Is this idea that realistically speaking, the political structure of every nation is going to be in defense of their economy. Like that's the point of the political structure, is to defend the economy. And so if that's what Nkrumah is reasoning here, then it's agreeable. Actually, funny enough, I think that's what I'm going to. I think that's like in my notes for writing my next book. I do actually point out that you would form, like, for basically you start with economics, then you go to politics, then you go to culture, then you go to ethics. I tend to, if you guys check back in my literature, the pro-black compendium, you'll see that I do relate morality and ideology together. So it's of course I might have been because I was familiar with Kwame Nkrumah's writing on it, but it's just interesting. So maybe I just went on a tangent, but hopefully that what I just said helped you out a little bit. If it didn't help you out, just let me know in the comments, so I could know which comment to delete. You know what I'm saying? No, I'm joking. I don't delete comments like that. All right. Well, unless they're like a bunch of vulgarities, but I don't really get too many comments, so it's not like. Anyway, all right. So I depart somewhat from the fashionable one. And I didn't. Yeah, all right. I depart somewhat from the fashionable one. It is often thought, well, so forth, right? Look at the fact we particular ideology no explicit. Let's see. But while it is defending its own social order, right? So you're supposed to defend your own social order, though. That's the objective of politics. Like if you're not defending your own social order, if you're not defending your own economics, then essentially like your economy is going to collapse, right? Like if the capitalists do not recruit you as a laborer, then their economy will collapse. So anyway, I depart somewhat from the fashionable sense. It is often thought that an ideology has to be a body of writing of one individual or a small group of individuals directed only at fundamental change in a society. This is an evident mistake. An ideology, even when it is revolutionary, does not merely express that which the they wish that a present social order should be abolished. It seeks also to defend and maintain a new social order which it introduces. But while it is defending its own social order, it is still an ideology and the same. That is to say, an ideology can remain an ideology while defending an existing progressive society. Nor can the fact that some particular ideology is not explicit on paper prevent it from being one. What is crucial is not the paper, but the thought. I have said an ideology seeks to bring a specific order into the total life of its society. To achieve this, it needs to employ a number of instruments. The ideology of society displays itself in political theory, social theory, and moral theory, and uses these as instruments. It establishes a particular range of political, social, and moral behavior, such that unless behavior of this sort fell within the established range, it would be incompatible with the ideology. What I mean may also be expressed in the following terms. Given the ideology of a society, then some political behavior would be incompatible with it, and some other political behavior would be compatible with it. Given a socialist ideology, right? For example, the political dictatorship of capital would be incompatible with it. Really? Political dictatorship of capital. Oh, okay. So political dictatorship of capital. So, yeah, I was thinking of the dictatorship of the proletariat. So that would be the political dictatorship of labor. So you say political dictatorship of capital, which is capitalism, is incompatible with socialism. Okay. So there's always a definite range within which social political theory and practice must fall if they are to conform to a socialist ideology. Thus, ideology displays itself in moral theory and practice. In the account of some Greek philosophers in the last chapter, I suggested how a humanist ideology held implication for political theory and illustrated this mainly from Aristotle. The ideology of society is total. It embraces the whole life of a people and manifests itself in their class structure, history, literature, art, religion. It also acquires a philosophical statement. If an ideology is integrative in intent, that is to say, if it seeks to introduce a certain order which will unite the actions of millions towards specific and definite goals, then its instrument can also be seen as instruments of social control. It is even possible to look upon coercion as a fundamental idea in society. This way of looking at society readily gives rise to the idea of a social contract. According to the idea, man lived during certain dark ages in the dim past outside the ambit of society. During those dark ages, man was alleged to have lived a poor, nasty, brutish, short, and fearful life. Life, not surprisingly, soon became intolerable, and so the poor men came together and subtly agreed upon a contract. By means of this contract, they waived certain rights of theirs in order to invest the representative with legislative and executive powers of coercion over themselves. So, for those of you who might not be familiar, social contract theory is more like one of these Western philosophers. I want to say Hume. I'm not 100% sure, but it could be Hume, like David Hume or whatever. But it's somebody. Somebody says something along the lines of this social contract. Could be Hobbes. I keep mistaking. Who knows, right? Why is that important though? So basically, but it's obviously not a realistic image of humans that they once lived by themselves, because if you understand that human evolution, you understand that humans came from older hominids, and so those older hominids were or even other hominids, if you're being realistic, they live in social groups themselves. So it would kind of be like, why would humans come from social groups from the older speciation of us, or the older iterations of species from us, and then separate and not be in social groups? Even lions are in social groups. So this image of social contracts and how man lived in the it's not realistic. It has nothing to do with reality, but it makes for a good philosophy in a sense, or it gives a good premise or basis for discussing things, but it's not really realistic when you understand that even the other primates are living in social groups. They're not living by themselves and then eventually developing civilizations where social contracts and waiving rights and so on and so forth, but that actually they just live in other groups. And like I said, there's the Hedzabe and so on and so forth. Now what you can say is that you could say, hey, look, maybe this Dark Ages more means the Ice Ages, and this Ice Age period for Wazungu might have had this sort of impact where they had to redevelop basic social skills after the ice receded, right? That might be a different sentiment. But to, just like to say that, all humans went through this sort of dark age or this sort of period is not really realistic. And again, like I said, you could look at Western history, but you have to remember that it's just Western history. It's not the universal history of humankind. It is just Western history. And I think that's one thing that Kwame Nkrumah is not doing right now, and I don't know why he's not doing it. But cause I understood before, because he does point out. I did point out to you guys earlier that he does say, "Hey, look, the only reason why to look at Western philosophy is just to teach it per se. it's not to act like it's yours." So he does know that this is not his history, but he kind of just says it's kind of I don't know what to say. It's just a little bit different. I wouldn't expect that, But anyway, let's say life not surprisingly soon became intolerable, blah, blah, blah. So we know that the social construct is quite unhistorical. Okay, so he goes, dang, man, what the... I gotta just read the next paragraph. All right, so anyway, we know that the social contract is quite unhistorical, for unless men already lived in a society that could have no common language, and a common language is already a social fact, which is incompatible with the social contract, right? Nevertheless, however, in those societies, it is that societies arose, the notion of society implies organized obligation. So he's like, oh, it's unhistorical because, you couldn't, how would you have common languages if you're, how would you have common languages? So I could have just read the next paragraph. Although I think that what I said earlier about the evolution actually does add a little bit of weight to it. Maybe he's going to talk about evolution later and I'll be like, damn it, you should lead with that, right? but yeah, or at least what, that's another thing too I want to point out to you guys as well. So in writing, I want to point out this in writing. I actually, when I went and tried to understand this, it was actually the right thing. Because what you do is that when you write paragraphs, you have to complete the idea. The thing is, this paragraph right here should have been over here. Because I actually just read the whole paragraph, and then I was like, let me divulge on it. The reason why you put this paragraph together is because they're technically the same idea. This paragraph would just basically, I don't know the English term for it, but let's say hanging paragraph. As to say that it's just a paragraph that really should have been in this section so that we could have, like a paragraph kind of like a complete thought. A sentence is a complete thought, a paragraph is a complete set of thoughts in a sense. And so, it's just like, you might be like, hey, Oni, you should have just read it. Why did you go on that tangent? It's like, no, I actually didn't go on a tangent. I was reading it, and that's how you're supposed to read. You're supposed to say, hey, look, this paragraph is a complete thought in a sense, or a complete set of thoughts, and so now you got to look at the complete set of thoughts on its own. This right here is not, this is just an addition, and it's like two sentences. This is just two sentences that should have been in the earlier paragraph. Just a FYI for those of you who might want to get into writing or what have you. So anyway, I've made mention of the way in which ideology requires definite ranges of behavior. It is difficult, however, to fix the limit of these ranges. Still, the impression is not to be formed from this difficulty that the ranges are not definite. Sorry, I'm just a little distracted. I have made mention of the way in which ideology requires definite ranges of behavior. Okay? A range of behavior. It is difficult, however, to fix the limit of these ranges. Still, the impression is not to be formed from this difficulty that the ranges are not definite, right? So that you have to have definite ranges, even if you can't define how, the limit of them, they're still definite. They are as definite as territories, even if, on occasion, border uncertainties arise between territories next to each other. Obviously, there are at least two senses of definiteness. The one sense is mathematical. In this sense, a range of conduct is definite if and only if every item of conduct either falls unambiguously inside it or falls unambiguously outside of it. In the other sense, a range of conduct is definite if there are items of behavior unambiguously falling inside it and items of behavior unambiguously falling outside it. Any ambiguity that there is must only be at the extremes. It is this possible fluidity at the extremes which makes growth and progress logically possible in human conduct. Every society stresses its permissible range of conduct and evolves instruments whereby it seeks to obtain conformity to such a range. It evolves these instruments because the unity out of diversity which a society represents is hardly automatic, calling as it does for means whereby unity might be secured and when secured, maintained. Though in a formal sense these means are means of coercion, in intent they are means of cohesion. They become means of cohesion by underlining common values, which themselves generate common interests and hence common attitude and common reactions. It is this community, this identity in the range of principles and values, the range of interests, attitudes, and of reactions which lies at the bottom of social order. It is also this community which makes social sanction necessary, which inspires the physical institution of society, like the police force, and decides the purpose for which they are called into being. So I'm going to give you guys an example so that you guys could know what I'm talking about, because this is an example I'm thinking about in my head, which is like there's like an age of consent. Right, there's an age of consent. You know, the changes depending on the country, but there's an age of consent. And for most countries, 9 is too damn young. Okay, 9 is too damn young for most countries. So, and Prince, you're an African, I'm assuming, right? You're an African. You think 9 is too damn young. Okay, now there's some people who don't think 9 is too young, but you as an African, you think 9 is too damn young, right? And when I say 9, I mean like 9 with somebody who's like, let's say, 35. Okay, so somebody's 35 and they're in a compound or whatever, and they see a 9-year-old on the other edge, right? And they're like, hey, she looks nice or whatever, which is weird, but you know, this is just to illustrate the point. Now, what Kwame Nkrumah is saying is that every society has a permissible range of conducts, and that 9-year-old, that 35-year-old pursuing that 9-year-old, whether it's a man or a woman, who knows? But the point is that them doing that is outside of the permissible range of conduct for the most part. Now, obviously, you know, when I said it was whether it's man or woman, some people do not care if a woman is pursuing a 9-year-old boy. But, again, but most people do care that a man is pursuing a 9-year-old girl. I don't know why, but, I mean, I don't know, sorry, I don't know why there's a difference between the two, but for purposes of this conversation, because some people are weird and they're going to be like, what? Well, who cares if the boy, you know, whatever, right? We're going to just go into the example of the man pursuing the 9-year-old girl, right? We're all like everybody's in agreement that that's weird, right? I mean, you should be in agreement that the other one's weird too, but you know what? Not even I'm not even interested in that. I mean, because I think most people are going to agree, but then, you know, it's whatever. Who cares, right? So anyway, so it's every society. So he's like, look, it involves instruments that are unity out of diversity. So like basically, you have a diversity of thoughts in regards to, you know, the age of consent. You know, some people are going to say 16, some people are going to say 17, some people are going to say 18. Very few people are going to say 9, but some people are going to say 9. Like the guy who's interested in the 9-year-old is going to say 9, right? He's going to exist. He's going to say 9 years old. Just like I said, there's going to be a woman who's going to be like 9-year-old boy, and it's like that's her, okay? So he's like, look, societies have ways to make sure that the common good, blah, 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 and some people might say it's coercion, right? But here's the thing. You don't disagree with that. You do not disagree with what somebody said, because the thing is this, the guy does end up touching the 9-year-old girl, and she's, you know, oh my gosh, nobody protected me, right? You don't mind killing the guy. You don't mind killing the guy. Now, he said, look, in the formal sense, you call that coercion. In the formal sense, you call that murder, right? In the formal sense, but the intent is cohesion. And the cohesion comes along around common values, common interests, and common reactions. You see what I'm saying? Common attitudes. That's what he's saying. And so it's a really like because you might be like, oh yeah, I don't like coercion, and I don't like force, and I don't like this, but you don't like pedophilia either. And the thing is this, that if you want a cohesive community, you have to exercise force as well. You understand? And you might say otherwise. You know, a lot of people are like, oh, we shouldn't use force, we shouldn't, you know, act on other people, we shouldn't, so on and so forth. But then, should this person be free to form relationships with a 9-year-old? Or should the 9-year-old be free to form relationships with this man? You know? 9-year-old across the way and she's all, hey, you know. Or a 9-year-old boy is across the way and it's like, hey, you know, I wouldn't mind if you came and sat on my lap, Miss Lady, you know? Or what have you, right? And should she be like, well, shit, he asked. You know? He's a grown man. And when does it stop? 6-year-old boy. Like for instance, my son, for instance, he's 6. I don't know what he's doing. Real talk. I don't know what he's doing, but like we're back on the continent, so it was on the continent, and like I allowed him to like I didn't really social distance him as much as I would in America, because America is like the COVID capital, and in Ghana they didn't care to really wear masks too much. I wore a mask, but I had my son wear a mask, but it was like kind of like like it's like COVID wasn't like as widespread or as unknown in a sense, right? They went through, they did what they had to do, and they kept it at bay. And like when we came into the country, we were tested and tested and all that kind of stuff. So it was that. Anyway, so my son, he would just hug women from the back, or just hug them from the front. Just be all up on women, just touching, so on and so forth. It was then it's you a brother, you just said it like, damn, that's what you do, like that's how he is, he just grab women, whatever, right? The point is that, and like I think and it's not like a sexual way, obviously, right? It's not a sexual way, but like if he were a man, it would be incredibly inappropriate. It would be incredibly bold. It would be like not necessarily Trump level, but it would be like that, because he's not doing it from a sexual way, but like let's just say I did see him like squeeze a booty, not like he was doing it consciously, like I want to touch a booty, but like he's just grabbing people, he's just a little boy. Point is this: he does that, and it's like there's like no sexual intent to it, like none whatsoever, right? Because he doesn't know anything about sex. Like I know he doesn't, because I'm with this guy. He doesn't know anything about it, right? Point is this though: a woman could easily be like, "Oh, I've never been touched like that before. Oh, I haven't been touched like that in so long," and then go and she wouldn't. Not saying easily like I would allow it. I'm just saying like in some alternate universe, right? Some other kid, obviously, right? A woman could be like, "Hey, this boy just touched me, and oh man, I want to do all sorts of stuff to him," and just mold him and change him and pervert him, and obviously, that's a terrible thing. Obviously, there's something disgusting and wrong and depraved and savage and about that. Now, I shouldn't say the word savage, but you guys know what I'm saying. So, and then like if you're in a community that like fostered that, where it's like, hey, this lady, she did something terrible to this kid, but it's cool because we don't believe in murder, we don't believe in restricting people, we don't believe in harming people, we don't believe in arresting people, we don't believe in coercion. If she wants to do this, she could do this. She could go to the freaking hospital ward and just like see little babies and just do whatever she wants. Like no. You have to you have to have some sort of coercion, some sort of security, some sort of maintenance of the normal ideology, the normal permissible conduct, and what's impermissible has its repercussions, and that's what Kwame Nkrumah is saying. I hope that was a good demonstration. It's kind of weird when I got into the my own son or whatever, but like luckily I was there. Nobody was doing anything like that. Nobody even thought of anything like that in regards to him. It was just kind of like. It was just interesting, like he's just a nice kid, he's just a nice, wonderful kid, and like I said, it would have been different if he was an adult, if it was me doing that kind of stuff, it would be like, damn, dude, like like when Malcolm X, I guess what was his name, the guy who was playing Malcolm X, some guy was playing Malcolm X in a movie, and he goes, damn, that brother's starving. like if a grown man's doing that, you'd be like, damn, he's starving, right? But anyway, sorry. Check this out. Indeed, when I spoke at the law conference at Accra in January 1962, I emphasized that law, with its executive arms, must be inspired at every level by the ideals of society. Nevertheless, a society has a choice of instruments. By this, I do not merely mean that different societies could have different instruments. I mean that a society can, for example, decide that all its instruments of coercion and unity shall be centralized. The logical extreme of this, where every permissible right is explicitly backed by an enactment, and where every social anti-deprivation is made explicit in a prohibitive enactment. That this logical extreme of centralization is, needless to say, impossible of attainment, but any society can attempt to approximate it to as much as it desires. A society, however, which approximates too closely to this extreme will engender such an unwieldy bureaucracy that the intention of bureaucracy will be annulled. Of course, ideally, the intention of bureaucracy is to achieve impartiality and eschew the arbitrary, but when a society develops an unwieldy bureaucracy, it has allowed this fear of the arbitrary to become pathological and is itself autocratic. So again, you go back to the example of the pedophile in a sense. What he's saying about bureaucracy and this sort of stuff is that the arbitrary is to say that, hey, look, what's the penalty for this lady going into the hospital and touching a bunch of little kids, right? What's the penalty for that, right? Is it written down somewhere? So, generally, you would generally say, hey, look, if you touch a child who's under a certain age, right? In certain countries, it might be 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, whatever. Not 20, but, but like a certain, child under a certain age, then you will be hit with this sort of legal penalty, whether it be murder, whether it be this sort of so forth. And so he's saying, instead of being arbitrary in the sense of, like, in a community, you might have somebody who does this stuff, and then you're like, hey, you're no longer allowed to be next to the hospital. And then for another community, like another person who does the same thing, you're like, hey, we're going to chop off your hands, or we're going to, or another person might be like, hey, we're going to send you to another country, like you lost, it's like, instead of making it arbitrary, you kind of set out laws so that it's no longer arbitrary, and it's pretty much a set rule that everybody who does the same thing gets the same penalty, because sometimes it could be that somebody who does something bad doesn't actually face any sort of punishment because they're rich or something, or because they're like the mayor's kid or whatever. All right, and you don't want that, pretty much. All right, it's not that you don't want that, but it's not. It doesn't always look good. All right, so and yet the society must count among its instruments of coercion and cohesion, prohibitions and permissions which are made explicit in a statutory way. In many societies, there is in addition a whole gamut of instruments which are at once subtle and insidious. The sermon is the pulpit, the pressures of trade unionism, the opprobrium inflicted by the press, the ridicule of friends, the ostracism of colleagues, the sneer, the snub, and the countless other devices that are non-statutory instruments by means of which societies exact coercion, by means of which they achieve and preserve unity. So, again, this is another one that he's saying that there's different things besides from just legal punishment. Obviously, you could be ridiculed. You could be, like, hey, this is the freaking kid toucher. You know what I mean? or get away from the person, right? That kind of stuff. Like, I was going to tell you another joke, but I can tell you this joke where Chris Rock was talking about, he was like, yeah, I think Michael Jackson's innocent. And, I don't think he did anything to any of the kids, and blah, blah, blah. And so somebody asked, would you let your kids sleep over at Michael Jackson's house? And they were like, and he was like, F no. I mean, like, it's like, I mean, the other joke, of course, is the one where the guy's like, I built 3 of those houses. Nobody calls me the house builder. I made that bridge over there. Nobody says I'm the bridge maker. I helped in the assistance of 12 births, right? 12 children were born with my hands. Nobody says that, hey, here's the guy, a bringer of life. But I messed with one goat, Anyway, well, like the idea is that, everybody calls him a goat. Anyway, all right, let me stop. All right, I hope that was funny for you, because otherwise, I just did that for no reason. But yeah, but it's like, that's like one of those non-statutory instruments that preserve unity and social cohesion, keeps men away from their goats, you know what I'm saying? Although, like I said, there are other countries where people mess with goats, so, take that out. Yeah, just, it's not, like, some people don't have those. Alright, let me stop. Alright, coercion, actually had me not eating pork for a minute, too. Like, I saw these white boys were, like, messing with these pigs. It was kind of weird. Like, somebody put on the TL, I also low-key muted that person afterward. Like, I was like, nope, not looking at that again. But, wait, did I mute them? Yeah. Anyway, well, at the moment I muted them, yeah, because it was just weird. Alright, so the coercion could, unfortunately, be rather painful, but it is signally effective in ensuring that individual behavior does not become dangerously irresponsible. The individual is not an anarchic unit. He lives in orderly surroundings, and the achieving of these orderly surroundings calls for methods both explicit and subtle. Actually, hold on a second. Sorry, let me read this again. Sorry. Coercion could unfortunately be rather painful, but is singularly effective in ensuring the individual behavior does not become dangerously responsible. So, you can have coercion that's painful. An individual is not an anarchic unit. He lives in an orderly surrounding, and the achieving of his orderly surroundings calls for methods both explicit and subtle. So, basically, you can't live your life like an anarchic unit. You have to, society's going to punish you if you are too much against what they're trying to do, what they're trying to accomplish. If you're trespassing on the safety of other people, then society will come down upon you, or society should come down upon you. Otherwise, you will constantly harm and hurt the other people. What I'm going to do though is I'm very thirsty. Damn, my phone blown up, huh? Anyway, what I'm doing is I'm very thirsty, so I'm going to just leave this commercial over here. I'm going to get some water, and I'll be back after this break.
This is D Webb with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Greetings, everyone. This is Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast, inviting you to tune in to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Greetings, fam. Tune in to The Learning Curve with me, the revolutionary matron on KWAZ Radio.
You are listening to the Pro-Black Perspective on KWAZ Radio.
Okay, sorry about that. Oh, man. I don't know if you guys could hear the heat come up. I can't really tell because I think I tried to listen again and I didn't hear anything. But, yeah, so just have to drink some water. So, one of the subtlest methods is to be found in the account of history. The history of Africa, as presented by European scholars, has been encumbered with malicious myths. It was even denied that we were a historical people. So, finally, he comes to Africa, I'm going to say. I mean, he's born in Africa, obviously, but, this whole book was kind of like, Europe. He did, one reference to Egypt that wasn't really that great. So now we can probably come into Africa, which is good. All right. It was even denied that we were a historical people. It was said that whereas other continents had shaped history and determined its course, Africa had stood still, held down by inertia. That Africa was once propelled into history by the European contact. African history was therefore presented as an extension of European history. Hegel's authority was lent to this ahistorical hypothesis concerning Africa, which he himself unhappily helped to promote. And apologists of colonialism lost little time in seizing upon it and writing wildly thereon. In presenting the history of Africa as the history of the collapse of our traditional societies in the presence of European advent, colonialism and imperialism employed their account of African history and anthropology as an instrument of their oppressive ideology. Earlier on, such disparaging accounts have been given of African society and its culture as to appear to justify slavery, and slavery posed against those accounts seemed the positive deliverance of our ancestors. When the slave trade and slavery became... So you see that whole argument, slavery is positive for us, right? It was a net positive because it allowed us to come into the Western contact. He's also familiar with that. And obviously he'll be familiar with that because he was educated in America, on top of, having been colonized in Africa. But anyway, earlier on, such disparaging accounts have been given of African society and culture as to appear to justify slavery, and slavery posed against these accounts seemed the positive deliverance of our ancestors. When the slave trade and slavery became illegal, the experts on Africa yielded to the new wind of change and now began to present African culture and society as being so rudimentary and primitive that colonialism was a duty of Christianity and civilization. Even if we were no longer on the evidence of the shape of our skulls, regarded as the missing link, unblessed with the art of good government. So missing link, of course, just for those of you who might not know, missing link is basically this idea that there was a hominid before humans, and then there's what happened with humans. So in the evolutionary range, there was Homo erectus, and then there was humans. And so the missing link is that thing between. It's subhuman, but it's not quite Homo erectus per se. And I don't know if missing link is referring to Homo erectus versus Homo sapien, but it's just this idea that there's something pre-human. And so he's saying that even though we're no longer on the evidence of our skulls regarded as the missing link, right, regarded as a pre-human species, right, unblessed with the arts of good government, material and spiritual progress, we were still regarded as representing the infancy of mankind. Our highly sophisticated culture was said to be simple and paralyzed by inertia. We had to be encumbered with tutelage. And this tutelage, it was thought, only could be implemented if we were first subjugated politically. The history of the nation is, unfortunately, too easily written as the history of its dominant class. But if the history of a nation or a people cannot be found in the history of a class, how much less can the history of a continent be found in what is not even a part of it, Europe? So history of a nation, this heat just like comes up. And I shouldn't tell you guys, I'm my bad. All right, so the history of a nation is unfortunately too easily written as the history of its dominant class, right? He's like, you shouldn't really write history as the history of its dominant class. But if a history of a nation or a people cannot be found in the history of a class, how much less can the history of a continent be found in what is not even a part of it? Europe. So he's like, if you shouldn't look at history as the history of the dominant class, right? Then why and how could you look at the history of a nation, right, or a people? How do you look at the history of a continent from the lens of a continent? So a place that's not even a part of it, which is Europe, right? So Africa cannot be validly treated merely as the space in which Europe swelled up. If African history is interpreted in terms of the interests of European merchandise and capital, missionaries and administrators, it is no wonder that African nationalism is in the forms it takes regarded as perversion and neocolonialism as a virtue, right? African nationalism is in the forms it takes regarded as a perversion. So people are like, hey, African nationalism isn't really like what? That's not this stuff. It's not European merchandise and capital. And then neocolonialism sees the virtue because it's like, hey, if you look at African history as just the interests of European merchandise, capital, missionaries, and administrators, then neocolonialism is a good thing, right? And African nationalism is a bad thing, right? Because it's like, we never had those nations, right? And so it's kind of like, it's really interesting. It's really interesting, although he puts it in a sentence. And so it's like, you might just like skip over it, or you might not really get it by yourself. Or not by yourself, but like you might not get it like right away in a sense. Like it's like it's so many ideas, so many good ideas just compressed into a sentence. So it's pretty interesting. Like if you just put the sentence up online, it really wouldn't mean anything to people. But like in the context, it's pretty good. It's like it's not a soundbite. That's what I'm saying. All right. So in the new African Renaissance, we place great emphasis on the presentation of history. Our history needs to be written. Oh, hold on a second. Can you guys hear me? All right. All right. So in the new African Renaissance, we place great emphasis on the presentation of history. Our history needs to be written as the history of our society, not as the story of European adventurers. African society must be treated as enjoying its own integrity. Its history must be a mirror of that society, and the European contact must find its place in the history only as an African experience, even if a crucial one. That is to say, the European contact needs to be assessed and judged from the point of view of the principles animating African society and from the point of view of the harmony and progress of this society. So you just like take the paradigm out of, it's like the history is written by is a history written by the lions or the gazelle, right? But if you're like writing the history of the gazelle, it should be like written from the perspective of the gazelle, right? Oh, the lions came in, as opposed to, the history of the lion, like from the perspective of the lion, which is, oh, we found some gazelle. You know what I mean? Yes, anyway. When history is presented in this way, it can become not an account of how those African students referred to in the introduction became more Europeanized than others. It can become a map of a growing tragedy and the final triumph of our society. In this way, African history can come to guide and direct African action. African history can thus become a pointer at the ideology which should guide and direct African reconstruction. Now, of course, it's going to be a little bit ironic because he's like, I looked at the back of the book, like the snippet on the back of my book because I purchased the book. And it kind of like he's going to use Islam, Christianity, and African traditional, in one. So again, I'm a little discouraged, but we're going to keep pressing, right? So this connection between an ideological standpoint and the writing of history is a perennial one. A check on the work of the great historians, including Herodotus and Thucydides, quickly exposes their passionate concern with ideology. Their irresistible moral, political, and sociological comments are particular manifestations of more general ideological standpoints. Classically, the great historians have been self-appointed public prosecutors, accusing on behalf of the past, admonishing on behalf of the future. Their accusations and admonishings have been set in a rigid framework of presuppositions both about the nature of the good man and about the nature of the good society, in such a way that these presuppositions serve as intimations of an implicit ideology. So that's pretty interesting. So he's like, writers of history are also really ideologues. Like they also make moral and political and sociological comments that are really ideological standpoints. So they have they're like the self-appointed public prosecutors in the sense that they accuse on behalf of the past and admonish on behalf of the future. So it's pretty interesting sentiment. It's kind of like destruction of black civilization, where Chancellor Williams would be like, oh snap, this was written in 1963? 1964? That's interesting. All right, before I go into that, Chancellor Williams would say, hey, you know what? White man is our freaking enemy. Because if you look at how these 10 case studies, just random case studies, white boys been destroying us from like jump. So it's like he does this public prosecution. He's like, hey, look, on behalf of the future and on behalf of the past, this is the thing that I want to come up with. I actually want to say this, though. So 1964. One of the guys, so I want you guys to know this. You could actually email me. My email address is O19, right? The word 19, and then the number 54, okay? So O19, and then the number is 54 at gmail.com, right? And, just like Oni, right? It's the first word, and then it's like, it could put the N-E-T-E-N, and that's 019, and then 54. Now, why I say 50? Now, why is it 1954? Was I born in 1954? No, I wasn't born in 1954, right? But the reason why it's 1954 is to say that was the year that 3 great African books were released, right? Check out the Job's book, Stolen Legacy, and this book, I can't remember the name of it. I have it, but I didn't really read it yet, which was about African history in that sense. So some brother, like I used to go to a bookstore, I used to work. I used to I guess kind of work or volunteer or whatever. I used to volunteer at an African bookstore, and it was not that long, like maybe like very short period of time. But the the brother was like 1954 was that year. You got to get all the classical works from that year, and I was like, really? And so I read the 1954 book from Chicken and Job. I read Stolen Legacy. I didn't read this other book that was like a general history of history, because I had another history book. Robin Walker's When We Ruled, and I just read that one. But the whole point was that, the fact that he's writing this 10 years after kind of gives you the impression that maybe he might have read Stolen Legacy, Check Out the Joke, and this other history book. I really should pull out that history book just to... Give me 2 seconds. My bookshelf is like way too crowded right now. I might need a second one. It's like way too crowded for me to find that book. So, but yeah. That's like I can't find it in time. I'll probably find it for another podcast, but it's not even important. You don't really care, right? Right, let's go. Even Rank, the great 19th century German historian who boasted that his aim was not to sit in judgment on the past, but only to show us what really happened, was far from being a mere chronicler of the past. He was, in spite of his claims, an engagé historian. The key to the attitude which he strikes in his historical works lies first in his view on the necessity of strife for progress, and second in his ideas on the source of the state and the relation of the individual to the state. Dutifully, let me just make sure I'm being recorded. Okay, good. Dutifully grinding an axe for his Prussian majesty. On the first point, Ranke holds that it is precisely through one state seeking a hegemony of Europe and thereby provoking a rivalry that the civilization of the European state is maintained. On the second point, he holds that the state, in being an idea of God, enjoys a spiritual personality, and hence that neither reform nor revolution is exploitable, for this would do violence to the personality of the importing state. He also holds that it is only through the state to which an individual belongs that he can develop and preserve his fullness of being, and the ideals of liberty which he is able to propose to Prussian subjects is a spontaneous subjection to the state. It is surprising that he should have explained Luther's condemnation of the Peasants' War. Ranke, writing history, implements an ideological viewpoint which he, at the same time, seeks to conceal. So that's also, this kind of tells you that you should probably if you want to write something, write some history. Like, I'm not going to do that, obviously, because I might, I don't know. But, like, write history, because in history you do, like, actually, I should tell you this. My first book, obviously, or my second book, I don't know. It could be one, but they're both unpublished, right? I mentioned them in the Book of Power, right? But basically, no, I think it was like Maroon and Bill for Self. It might have been like my second unpublished book, right? But like I used to like try to sell that on African Publishers website. But I have this history in it, right? Where I talk about the history, like I just do a big summary of African history, and I point out how we messed up from a lack of Pan-Africanism. So like you see in it like the ideological strain of, oh well, this country was, eventually fell by allying with this Arabs, and the Arabs and these Africans fought these Africans, and then eventually even those Africans failed, and what happened with there was that it was a lack of brotherhood, a lack of African solidarity. And so like again, like you can, like one of the things about history and how you read history is that you do pick up on a meta narrative, and that meta narrative is going to be that ideology that you're pointing out. So you see with this guy Ranke, he's really like trying to solidify this Prussian nation, this German nation, and he's like, hey, you know what? We don't have to worry about like revolution and blah blah blah. Like we're not trying to help it. Like we're trying to form something, and that's what Kwame Nkrumah is pointing out. Anyway, so I mentioned art as another of the subtler instruments of ideology. One can illustrate this in various ways. So just like he's saying, history is a valid way. Art is also another one. And that's important. That's important for us when we're trying to create art. It's like you got to go along with an ideology. But again, what is the ideology that we have now? It's Consciencism is considered one of them, right? Or Kwame Nkrumah is trying to establish that Consciencism is in fact that ideology for us, and so I think that's going to be the next chapter, which might be I shouldn't say next week anymore. I should just say that's the next video. So check it out when you can. All right, I have mentioned art as another of the subtler instruments of ideology. One can illustrate this in various ways. In the medieval age of Europe, when religion was considered to be the main preoccupation of life, all other concerns were subordinated to religious, and actions tended to win approval to the extent that they supported religion, or at least were not in conflict with it. And actually, that's all I want to say right here, too. This is like Garvey. Garvey today is, oh my gosh, I'm reading this Garvey book, and I'm like, I told you guys I'm trying to read 3 books. I didn't even get to look at, I'm going to finish this, and then I'll probably open up Wealth of Nations, but I didn't even get to look at Wealth of Nations because I'm struggling with this Garvey book because it's so religious. Now, if you read Garvey and Garveyism, I do believe, or I do recall his wife, Amy Jacques Garvey, saying he was so religious because African Americans were so religious, or the Western world is so religious, right? But this kind of touches on that same idea here, where he's like, in the medieval age of Europe, right? And just like the modern day of America, right? Where religion was considered to be the main preoccupation of life, right? If you go to, I'm not saying that religion is the main preoccupation of life in the Western world, but it is a significant preoccupation of life. It's like almost a universal preoccupation of life, particularly among African Americans or Black people. Not just African Americans, but like I said, I was in Ghana, and they were all just religious. Like if you weren't a Christian, you were a Muslim. If you weren't a Christian, it's because you had a hijab on your head. That was just the I'm not talking about the girls, obviously. I'm not too sure the men wear hijabs, but anyway. Main preoccupation, all of the concerns were subordinated to the religious, and action tended to win approval to the extent that they supported religion, or at least were not in conflict with it. And Garvey explicitly says, don't be only an idiot would be in conflict with the church. He explicitly says that early on in the book. Only an idiot would be, not idiot, but I think he says fool maybe, but he's like, nope. Oh, I'm about almost every one of his speeches. He's just like, by the way, I'm definitely a half. Hey, I'm definitely a Christian. I believe that there's this guy, blah, 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 I believe in, he says something that's not what you'd expect a Christian to say. And then he's like, but don't get me wrong, I'm definitely a Christian, he's like some sort of, spiritual belief, oh, God is a creator and blah, blah, blah. But a lot of it, I would say, it's kind of the same mentality of the Middle Ages of Europe, where it's if you don't do something that has if you do something that's conflict with the church, right, that's your fucking head. Sorry, I don't mean to curse, but that's your head, right? Anyway, in the second chapter, and you see that word curse, I think the word curse might have some sort of quasi-religious background too. But anyway, in the second chapter, I illustrated how economic activity was subordinated to the religious concern. In the second chapter, I illustrated how economic activity was subordinated to the religious concern. art too became infected by this idea. It accordingly specialized in biblical illustration and apocalypse of paradise. Apocalypses of paradise. Maybe he meant apocalypses or paradise. Like it might be an or right here. Which is like, as far as I know about the Bible, there's this theory called Revelations. Or they have hell and they have heaven. So it's like, I know there's like one called Dante's Inferno or something like that. So that's a big one. And then there's also, images of heaven, and, for those of you who might not be familiar, I mean, everybody knows this one, I think. But John Henry Clark, which is like JHC too, right? But anyway, John Henry Clark, he said when he was younger, he saw images of devils, in hell and angels in heaven, and all the devils were black and all the angels were white, and he was like, well, shit, I'd rather be in hell then. You know what I mean? Like I'd be with the black folk, you know what I'm saying? But, that's one of the things that some people, like one of the important iconographies that Wazungu uses to, impose that sort of thing. And actually, when I was in Africa, I did ask people, what is the image of Jesus here? Or what is the image of God here? And they would point out, it's a white man, Now, some of them would confide that they don't believe in a white Jesus. They believe that it's just a representation that the Wazungu gave them. But it's still kind of backwards that you would that Wazungu was giving you something for the purpose of whatever, and you're just like, well, I don't believe that part, but I believe in this other part, turn the other cheek, some old dumb stuff, though. And for those who don't know, like, the Bible's just ridiculous. In terms of, like, the ethics that it's trying to promote, it's really ridiculous, to the point where no serious African person would embrace it, let alone, not necessarily entirety, but even, like, principally, you know what I mean? Like, it's just ridiculous. Turn the other cheek. If somebody, so it's just a little bit ridiculous, right? So, all right. So today in the socialist countries of Europe, where the range of conduct is fixed by socialist principles, that particular art which glorifies the socialist ideology is encouraged at the expense of that art which the supremacy of aristocrats or the bourgeoisie might inspire, right? So he's like, in the socialist countries, the art is going to glorify socialism, right? And it's encouraged at that expense, right? So the former in general encouraged the bucolic and classical kind of art, its subject appropriated from the class of gods and goddesses and leisurely flute-playing shepherd boys. The bourgeoisie, for their part, injected a Puritan strain into art and in general directed it along lines of portraiture. Art has not, however, always propagated ideals within an already accepted ideology. It has sometimes strived in a vanguard of reform or even revolution. Goya, for example, was responsible for significant conscience-stricken and protest painting in which, by paint and brush, he lambasted the brutalities of the 19th century ruling class. Here, he was not defending an ideology, but was exposing one to attack. In African art, too, society was often portrayed. It is moral. And actually, I want to say this, too, for those of you who might not be familiar. So on the podcast, on the Discord. So definitely try to come at me on the Discord. On Discord, I put up in the funny section. There's a sister who just made some art that it just wasn't really, like, basically you want your art to follow the market in a sense, but you also could have your art not follow the market. And this is kind of like what Kwame Nkrumah was also engaging, which is this idea that, the dominant society kind of determines what art is going to pass. And just the same as, like, when I said the last podcast, which I probably shouldn't have, but I said last podcast that, I want to have marketable books, right? But the idea is that, it's market driven, particularly in this capitalist side. It's market driven in the sense that, I'm writing heavy philosophical texts. I'm not necessarily as heavily philosophical as this text, right? But it's also like, who's going to read it? And just like I just pointed out to you earlier, these books are not even on sale in Ghana. Like, these books are not even on sale in Ghana. The only book I saw inside of one of these major bookstores was Africa Must Unite. But for the most part, this heavy kind of literature is not really something that sells in capitalist economies, in a sense, per se, if you will, right? But of course, that's a little bit hard for me to really defend in the sense that, earlier I had the series while I was in Africa, the series called, The Open Secret to White Domination. And in that document, what happened was, I was pointing out how a lot of people are reading Wealth of Nations, which was also a heavy text. Maybe not as heavy as this one, but it was a heavy text, notwithstanding, right? Goya, for example, was responsible for a significant, but basically there was this woman who painted pictures of obese women's bodies, like no head, no feet, just their bodies. And then she was like, I'm homeless, like my rent is due. Can you donate to me? And it's like, instead of changing her art, she was like, or even like including the women's faces, which might actually sell it. She was like, I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing because, and like part of it is like, maybe she's going against the dominant ideology of, thin is the win, and all that kind of stuff. But, there's obviously social repercussions to that, and say that, realistically speaking, most people who are producing art are producing it along the lines of thin is the win, and you also see this when, like, if you go to these real art websites, like a lot of people are trying to do like superhero type physiques, that's like the predominant type of physique, your buff man and your busty woman, the busty thin woman. And that's really like, if you're trying to sell stuff, particularly in America, that's what you would do. If you're trying to sell stuff in Japan, you might do the anime aesthetic or something like that. So it's like there's different aesthetics depending on what market you're in. And it's not going to be like whatever you want it to be. Now, you can go against what what it is already, but you might not necessarily, like, you might just be a minority in so doing, right? And you might be underfunded if in so doing, right? Just like how, like, when I'm writing books, like, again, one of the reasons why I even want to write a self-help book is because I asked somebody in Africa who was like, that was like, hey, what kind of books do you guys read? Like, I'm trying to go into these bookstores. What kind of books do you guys read? And they're like, hey, look, like, we usually self-help, we usually romance, we usually, the same thing that you read in America. But it's like, why would I write deep philosophical text if that's not what people are really buying, But, of course, I'm probably still going to do it, but, well, like, that's just me being, like the lady who just like, here, some obese body, buy this picture of an obese body, Like, no, I don't want to, right? That's not what I would buy if I were to buy art. Anyway, in African art, too, society was often portrayed. It is a moral philosophical preoccupation in terms of which this portrayal was done, which explains its typical power. It is this also which explains the characteristic distortion of form in African art. In the portrayal of forces, whether as forces of the world or of generation and death, of the forces of destiny, it is essential that it should not be delineated as something assimilated and overcome. And this is the impression which the soft symmetries of lifelike art would have given. It is to avoid this impression of force overcome that African art resorted to distortion of form. So he's talking about different types of African art, and some of them had like the distorted forms. And actually, I was thinking about this earlier too, that some people, like I said, there's a Japanese aesthetic, there's an African aesthetic, and we don't really do animations in that African aesthetic as much as I would like us to do. So, and I say this in reflection to, I recently came across something that the Japanese were doing in regards to like retelling stories of like retelling a Western story, but they do it in their own aesthetic. And I'm thinking to myself, when we retell Western stories, we kind of do it inside of the Western aesthetic as well. And that's like not what we should do. I think personally, I'm going to try to develop the African aesthetic in my own art as well. But anyway, by treating of such examples, one may illustrate subtle methods of coercion and cohesion. To cope with the teddy boy problem, many churches in Britain form clubs. And these clubs, they hope to entice teddy boys by the provision of rock and roll music. I don't know what a teddy boy is. I'm not even trying to figure out what that is. Once the youth were so trapped, the churches expected so to influence and to coerce them to reinstate their behavior within the range of passable conduct. The church used a non-subtle instrument, which at the same time not centralized. So I guess he's saying that they got some problem. I don't know what it is. But they used rock and roll music to get that problem. But I'm not even, like, that sounds weird. When you say the church, you say boy, like, I'm just not even, I don't want to search it, I don't need that in my Google history. You know what I'm saying? I don't say, why are you using Google anyway? But, like, I don't need that in my Google history. You know what I'm saying? All right, in the Soviet Union, on my DuckDuckGo, you know what I mean? Or whatever African website you got. All right. In the Soviet Union, too, open and systematic ridicule was resorted to. And when this did not work well enough, teddy boys were moved from one area of the country to another. Why is he still talking about teddy boys? I don't know what that is. Through inconveniencing them, Soviet authorities sought by a non-statutory instrument to influence and so coerce teddy boys in order to bring their activities within the range of passable behavior. Oh my gosh, he's gonna have me look up Teddy Boy. Oh my gosh, no. And don't even write me in the comments, hey, bro, Teddy Boy. I don't want to know. I don't want to know. We're just gonna skip over it. I think that's the last time he says it. We're gonna skip over it. All right, so this is like, boy, Teddy Boy, church, don't want to hear it. But at first it says Soviet, so I'm like, maybe, nah. All right, these instruments all relate to some conception of the desirable society. This is a conception which is nurtured by ideology. As the conception of the desirable society changes, some of its instruments too change. The subtle ones changing in a quiet and discreet way. When this happens, it is said that new ground is broken. Philosophy, too, is one of the subtle instruments of ideology and social cohesion. Indeed, it affords a theoretical basis for the cohesion. In the Republic of Plato, we are confronted with an example in which philosophy is made the theoretical basis of a proposed social order. In that proposal, philosophy would be an instrument of the ideology belonging to the social order proposed by Plato. Philosophy performs this function in two ways. It performs it as a general theoretical statement to which a specific social political theory is parallel. I have illustrated this in the discussion of some early Greek philosophers in the second chapter. Philosophy also performs this ideological function when it takes shape as political philosophy or as ethics. Through political philosophy, it lays down certain ideals for our pursuit and fortification, and it becomes an instrument of unity by laying down the same ideals for all the members of a given society. As ethics, philosophy proposes to throw light upon the nature of moral philosophy, or moral principles and moral judgment. Just checking if I can be heard. It also seeks to expose the source of the validity of ethical principles and so of moral obligation. In ethics, we have an instrument of great fascination, which runs parallel to statutory instruments without itself being statutory. Moral laws were never passed. There are no policemen or courts to ensure adherence to them. So he's like, yeah, so moral, like, ethics usually runs parallel, but they're never, like, past themselves, right? And nobody enforces your ethics, right? But they run parallel to the, statutory, which is, again, you go back to the reason why I use the pedophile example, or the pedophile example is because that's an example that most of us agree with. Or even, like, and it's not as I mean, I guess it is the same as sexual assault, but, that's something you don't really want to talk about anyway, right? But like, those are kind of things where it's like, you would articulate that ethically you don't want to mess with a child, right? Now it would run parallel to laws that say, hey, you know what? She's under, or she are under 16, you're being charged with something, And it's another one is like, kidnapping children is another sort of crime. Another one would be, another for morals would be, like, let's say, not, like camping in the streets, like delaying people. You could be like, hey, it's unethical to just delay other people, and then make it so that, you don't just, like, sit in the middle of the street and, like, just hold up the highway, or even for murder, like, that kind of stuff. Anyway, so there's a certain fascination about morality. When someone asks why he has to take notice of any state law, the intention of the law can be explained to him. If he is not satisfied, it can be pointed out to him that he supported a certain constitution, or at least that a certain constitution is binding upon him. And under that constitution, Parliament is empowered to enact laws. If this does not satisfy him, then it can be pointed out to him that the laws of the land are to be taken note of on pain of unpleasant consequences. But if someone should ask why he has to be moral, a similar kind of answer cannot be made to him. Indeed, the fact led David Hume to say that reason could not tell him why he should not prefer the safety of his little finger to the survival of mankind, right? Yeah, so obviously you see David Hume, but like that's actually, so those of you might not be familiar. I did actually, my son just woke up, so I'm gonna have to take another break soon. But like he wakes up, goes to the restroom, and then I gotta do what I gotta do. It's 9:00 right now, 9:17 for me. All right, on November 4th, 2021, European calendar, right? But anyway, so so earlier today, in fact, November 4th. Right, on my Twitter, I saw this this video. I put it on my Discord under funny, where this guy's like, this woman goes to this guy's Asian boy, and usually I don't try to put Asian people, but it was interesting. Where she goes to the Asian guy and says, "Hey, would you cheat on me for $1 billion?" Right, and he's like, "Yes, absolutely." Like, what? I would do it for less. I'd do it for 100,000. Because that's money we could have together. you know. But what it tells you is that, and most people are agreeing like, yeah, shoot, $1 billion, $100,000, $1 million, whatever, right? It's like, yeah, they agree because it's saying to themselves, that's a lot of money that you can have just for sex, in a sense. And the guy eventually says, hey, you got cheated on for free. You know what I mean? Like, you ain't getting nothing from being cheated on before. So why would you not want to be cheated on for billions of dollars, or $1 billion, right? Not that anybody's really doing that, but what it tells you is that our bodies are for sale. Like, ethically, morally, it tells you that our bodies are for sale, right? And here's the thing. It's like, if you would sell your body for money, why would you not sell the resources of your country for money? Why would you not sell somebody else's body for money if you would sell your own body, right? And that's where the ethics comes in. So you kind of see that the corruption of Africa, and obviously this is an Asian man, so it's not like it's the corruption of, it's not like he really has anything to do with Africa. But, like, I mostly put this out because there were black people that I was, who were like, yeah, I agree, totally, he's right, But the thing with that is, like you see that ethics is not even universal. But even notwithstanding that, loyalty, which would be something that you would expect to be reasonable and rational, isn't even something that you would grasp as well, at least according to Hume, it's not something that you would you can't really reason. Why would I prefer the safety of my little finger over the survival of mankind? Like, why would I put my finger as less valid over mankind? It's the same as that, hey, realistically speaking, if I would sell my own body for $1 billion, why wouldn't I sell somebody else's body for $1 billion? If if I'm clearly, I could be bought, and obviously my selling my own body is just worse for me. You know what I mean? Like, it's just worse for me. Like, why am I? You know what I mean? So it really speaks to, because then you might form an ethical argument and say, well, when you're selling your own body, it's just your own body. Whereas if you're selling somebody else's body, that's not yours to sell, right? You can say that, right? But again, you're asking somebody else to bring harm or bring discomfort to their own selves. So hopefully you can look at both sides. It's not about whether we're arguing with it. It's like, because I don't need to have an argument with you because you're not even here, right? Like, I'm legit recording this in my living room. You're not here, right? But what I want you to get is that you see that ethics doesn't apply the same way. Now, as Kwame Nkrumah points out, you have these laws, and laws can be defended or defendable. You can say, hey, look, you're actually in this Constitution. You actually are a citizen. You actually are a part of this Parliament. You actually agreed to this. Even if you might say, a lot of people say, well, I'm not a citizen. I'm a citizen, but I didn't agree to being a citizen. It's like, yeah, you did. If you really look at the history of the world, you did. You definitely did, because you definitely submitted that birth certificate. You know what I mean? Like, you definitely your folk definitely did submit that birth certificate. I mean, if not you, somebody who had custody of you did definitely say, yeah, I want this person to be a citizen. You know what I mean? But outside of that, like that's what it is. That's the world. The world does have this society that's controlled by unpleasant consequences, pain of unpleasant consequences. There is this binding from these parliaments, from these lands, from these nations. And as far as ethics are concerned, ethics, now there's two ways to look at it. You could look at it like how David Hume would look at it, which is ethics are not really that universal. But on the other hand, the way how I look at it personally is like, yeah, ma'at is that principle, And actually, it's interesting, like I said, you go back to those Kemet quotations. I don't have my browser open, so I'm not going to just quote it word for word. But, there is this idea that, ma'at is about quality over quantity, And it's just a philosophy of quality over quantity. And how, those communities that seek quantity, foremost, are like bound for decadence. And so the example of, I would sell my body for $1 billion, or I'll sell my neighbor for $1 billion, or whatever, $100,000, or what have you, right? That is the quantity, that is the decadence that you were trying to go away from in the ancient Kemetu community. And I point that out, just because, obviously we're deep in the Western philosophies, but I point that out, mainly so that people understand that one of the things about, even if you were to go into this Plato discussion or whatever, right? But one of the things about having the African leadership that has a good moral foundation, has a good African philosophy, is that, those are the kind of people that are in charge. The people who are not trying to sell other people. Because a lot of the commoners, a lot of the people around you are definitely willing to sell other people, if not their own bodies, to the highest bidder. And usually the highest bidder is a white person, because who else has $1 billion to spend for sex, and I do want to say that I hate to go back to this children thing, but I was in this, like I said, when I was in a university, there was a sister who came up to us and she was it was like they had some conference and they had the Congo. This is where I was exposed to the Congo idea. That's where I was actually exposed to Nkrumah as well. But this sister came in before and she was talking about the sex trafficking that was going on in the state that I was in, and she was saying that most of it was white girls. Obviously, she was one of the rare black girls, but she was like, the people who are paying $400, $500 for sex were not the working class. They were the ruling class, and they're paying to have sex with little children. She was a little girl at the time. She was kidnapped or whatever, right? But that's what it is. Like, who's gonna pay $1 billion for sex or $100,000 for sex with you? It's gonna be somebody who has $100,000 to burn, And so it's just a sentiment here that a lot of people are okay with being sold to white folk, and that should be that's like I said in the Book of Power, it's okay if that's what you believe. It's not okay if that's what your leadership believes, and you want to hold your leadership to a higher standard. And that's partly why I also advocate for those kind of social structures. But again, we're reading this book, and if you want to read my book, you check it out. I should have a commercial, shouldn't I? I should have a commercial. Why didn't I think of that? All right, could I have a commercial for the network? I could just have another one for the thing, because I have this cool rap. If you guys don't know. All right. So anyway, commercials. Philosophers grappling with the question of the source of moral obligations have attempted different sorts of answers. Many have given their answer in terms of the individual psychology, in terms of the pleasure or the pain which certain courses of action entail for their perpetrator. Here, the philosophers have tried to anchor moral obligation in something in regards to where the question, why would they hope to be impossible? Why would they hope to be impossible? They accordingly expected that the question why one likes pleasant things and dislikes painful things could not be sensibly asked. If therefore a moral obligation could be founded on pleasure and pain in such a way, the morality raised expectations of pleasure and immorality raised expectations of pain, a final answer would be produced to the question why one should be moral, but this account relates to the individual welfare and not the social, right? So obviously, knowing Kwame Nkrumah's pattern, he's going to say things that he doesn't really agree with at first. So, and obviously he gave out I was going to say, hey, I wasn't going to say this elegantly, but yeah, or eloquently, right? But yeah, and if this pain pleasure thing doesn't apply to social thing, as to say, I wouldn't sell my own body, but I can sell my other friend. That doesn't have any pain or pleasure on me per se, right? So, but yeah, that's just expounding on it. A few have tried to base moral flaws on the nature of the human reason itself. In this way, they hope to give a final answer to the question why one should be moral. If moral laws were purely commands of the reason, to ask why one should be moral would be like asking why one should be consistent. Just as consistency is a requirement of human discourse, so morality could be a requirement of human action. Yet others, eschewing a psychological or rationalistic answer, explore a sociological one, giving their account in terms of the general welfare or the general consensus. According to the utilitarians, for example, an action is right to the extent that it tends to promote the general welfare, and wrong to the extent that it tends to hinder it. Here, they regard as devoid of meaning the question why one ought to seek the general welfare. If this question is devoid of sense, so is the question why one ought to be moral. A consequence of this view is that the social welfare officers should be among the most ethical of men. So again, he's just saying why that's not a great idea. The need for subtle means of social cohesion lies in the fact that there is a large portion of life which is outside direct central intervention. In order that this portion of life should be filled with order, non-statutory methods are required. These non-statutory methods, by and large, are the subtle means of social cohesion. But different societies lay different emphasis on these subtle means, even if the range of conformity which they seek is the same. The emphasis which a particular society lays on a given means depends on the experience, socioeconomic circumstance, and the philosophical foundation of that society. I want to point out this too. I want to point this out. So when I was in Ghana, there was like so few police. It was so beautiful. Like I probably saw like 7 there, like 7 total. And I was like living an outdoors life. I would see 7 just walking outside of my house. You know what I mean? like I would see 7 walking outside my house in that of New York, right? Well, not really, but still. Like the point being that like depending on where you are, you're like in a police state, literally, right? It was wonderful. But like a lot, like there was no crime there, It was not that people were doing crime against each other. It was like there were very few stoplights, for instance, but there were no car crashes, and there was a very systematic and formulated, well thought out way of how people were driving pretty safely, making right turns, making left turns, without crashing on each other, sharing the same roads, very narrow roads. And with people, no less, like human beings walking on the side of the road, not on the sidewalk, on the side of the road, they would still navigate around these human beings, all things considered. It was a very, a system that was, like he says, there was a cohesion there, but it was non-statutory, or it was, or not to say it was non-statutory in the sense that you could just, like there was no laws, because obviously there were driving laws, but like people were just self-regulating, and it was really beautiful, Like even when I was getting like hustled by people, because here's the thing, I had like $500 cash on me, I want to say, or let's say as far as people were concerned, I had, let's say $200 cash on me, right? $200 cash on me in that currency is like $1,200 cash on me. So like basically I had $1,200 cash on me, right? In that context, right? That's a lot of, like that, like if you have $200 cash, like you don't get $200 cash in America, right? People are like, wait, this guy got $200 cash, let me rob this guy, right? Like, or $1,200 cash, let me rob this guy, right? Everybody knew I had money in this particular beach that I went to, and I was surrounded by everybody else. But nobody like tried to rob me, like directly. They tried to rob me by like overcharging me, but they didn't try to rob me by like kidnapping me or something. That's a different sort of ethic altogether. Where it's like, yeah, we would overcharge you because clearly you have money, but we will not like forcefully take money from you. And it's just a whole different type of social cohesion, so it's a type of regulation, because you actually could have like just left your stuff there, notwithstanding the fact that everybody wanted it. Give me 2 seconds again. I'm gonna go. Like I said, my son uses the restroom, and you gotta just take care of your children, right?
This is D Webb with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Greetings, everyone. This is Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast, inviting you to tune in to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Greetings, fam. Tune in to The Learning Curve with me, the revolutionary matron on KWAZ Radio.
You are listening to the Pro-Black Perspective on KWAZ Radio.
Okay, yeah, I forgot to mute it. I just ran out. All right, so usually you'd mute it. So there we go. Socioeconomic. Did I read this part? I feel like I think I read this Africa part. No. This emphasis of particular society lays on a given means depends on the experience, socioeconomic circumstances. Yeah, a philosophical foundation. Hopefully I read that already. So in Africa, this kind of emphasis must take objective account of our present situation at the return of political independence. From this point of view, there are the 3 broad features to be distinguished here. African society has one segment which comprises... Oh yeah, so you see he's going to do the whole religion thing right here. I I said it too early. Let's see. From this point of view, there are three broad features to be distinguished here. African society has one segment which comprises our traditional way of life. It has a second segment which is filled by the presence of Islamic tradition in Africa. And it has a final segment which represents the infiltration of the Christian tradition and culture of Western Europe into Africa, using colonialism and neocolonialism as its primary vehicles. These different segments are animated by competing ideologies, but since society implies a certain dynamic unity, there needs to emerge an ideology which, genuinely catering for the needs of all, will take the place of the competing ideologies and so reflect the dynamic unity of society and be the guide to society's continual progress. So here's where I'm going to be like, because my thing is that I do not like, I mean, it's not about me, but yeah, it's not about me. All right. So, right, one thing that I learned from going to Africa was I got to get rid of my ego. You know what I mean? I have an ego. And the thing is that Americans have egos. Like, I'm just, like, at the end of the day, I'm definitely an American. They made me know I was a foreigner when I was there. For wrong reasons, but still, they knew I was a foreigner, right? Well, they guessed come my hair that I was a foreigner. They were like, what? Only somebody from another country would have that hair. But it's like, nobody really has my hair in America either. It's just my hair. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's just my choice. But anyway, but yeah, you see, he's like, different segments are competed by, so each advise, blah, 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 emergent analysis, which generally catering for the needs of all, right? So, like, it is what it is. All right, so the traditional face of Africa includes an attitude towards man, which can only be described in its social manifestations as being socialist, right? So the traditional Africa is socialist. This arises from the fact that man is regarded in Africa as primarily a spiritual being, a being endowed originally with a certain inward dignity, integrity, and value. It stands refreshingly opposed to the Christian idea of the original sin and the degradation of man, right? He's like, traditional Africa was socialist, blah, blah, blah. This idea of original value of man imposes duties of a socialist kind upon us. Herein lies the theoretical basis of African communalism. This theoretical basis expressed itself on a social level in terms of institutions such as the clan, underlining the initial equality of all and the responsibility of many for one. In the social situation, it was impossible for classes of a Marxian kind to arise. By a Marxian kind of class, I mean one which has a place in the horizontal social stratification. Here, classes are related in such a way that there is a disproportion of economic and political power between them. In such a society, there exists class which are crushed, lacerated, and grounded down by the encumbrance of exploitation. One class is upon the neck of another. So basically what he's saying is that there wasn't this, like, you can't apply the Marxian distinctions in classical Africa, right? Classical Africa was a communalistic society with clans that didn't have these this sort of class division and this thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. It didn't have that. That's an interesting sentiment. Again, remember, I do also want to say this might be because this was an agricultural culture, and not just an agricultural culture, but like an agricultural culture with like, it wasn't like landlords per se. It wasn't a feudalist society per se. It was more so just like he pointed out, clan based on and so forth. I wouldn't necessarily call this socialist, although I could see how he says it's communalist. But it's interesting because in trying to be a Marxist and also acknowledging that there wasn't this Marxian kind of class, it kind of like defeats the point. But I think that's a pretty interesting description. I don't know if I can say anything else about that, so we're gonna keep going. In traditional African society, and not that I can't say anything. I think I was supposed to say something else, but I forgot it, so it's whatever. In the traditional African society, no sectional interest could be regarded as supreme, nor did legislative and executive power aid the interests of any particular group. The welfare of the people was supreme. But the colonialism came and changed. Oh, and I want to say this too, for you that might not know. So my son, like I told you, he woke up and he got out of the room, and he's probably hungry too. But what's going to happen is this. When I shut down, 30 seconds later, he's going to show up and be like, hey, I want some food, right? But like, it's nice that, he's at that point where he's like, hey, my Baba's podcasting, my Baba's recording, I'm going to just wait. I'm going to try to be quiet, and then when he's finished, I'm going to come to the room and join him, and we're going to enjoy our day. But, just something cute, All right. And, if guys can use the word cute. All right, so in the traditional African society, no sectional interest could be regarded as supreme, nor did legislative and executive power aid the interests of any particular group. The welfare of the people was supreme. Now, again, this is kind of like, people say that, people say the people in the diaspora romanticize Africa. And of course, you could reason that Kwame Nkrumah, in being educated in the North, in the Western world, could be considered, espousing the Western view as the diaspora view himself. But obviously this is not a universal. There were definitely hierarchies and supreme interests and all those sort of things inside of traditional Africa. Now, whether you say traditional Africa also amounts to these Islamic societies, like I said, Sunjata in the last one, is a question in and of itself. But whether you say the Ashanti, the Yoruba, so on and so forth, do they have executive powers and legislative and so on and so forth, and those sort of things? Like, do they have hierarchies and all that kind of stuff? Like, that's another question. Now, if you go to the Shona, maybe you might find this thing that he's talking about, but it's not necessarily the case that traditional African society is like universally just, we're just about the people, and that might just be, whatever it is. But again, like I said, in history, you tell history, history is good propaganda, it's his story, so you can say something like traditional African society. Now, what I would say is that you have to get away from the risk that a lot of us do, which is called a logical fallacy, where we do this, appeal to authority, where we say, hey, you know what? Look, Kwame Nkrumah just said, in traditional African society, there were no sectional interests. And then we just run with that because it's like, hey, he said it. He's the president of Ghana, But that's just another conversation altogether, right? But colonialism came and changed all this. First, there were the necessities of colonial administration, to which I referred in the introduction. For its success, the colonial administration needed a cadre of Africans who, by being introduced to a certain minimum of European education, became infected with European ideals, which they tacitly accepted as being valid for African societies. Because these African... this is like so ironic, because he's like a Marxist, Anyway, because these African instruments of the colonial administration were seen by all to be closely associated with the new sources of power, they acquired a certain prestige and rank to which they were not entitled by the demands of the harmonious development of their own society. And of course, you could also say, hey, this guy's the president of Ghana based off of his European education, whereas I think his family might have just been a bunch of weavers. You know what I mean? So it's like to say that he probably wouldn't have been the president of the community in a traditional African society as well. But, that's no fault of his. And I think that, like, if anybody's... I mean, I don't want to say if anybody's deserving, he is. But he is definitely deserving. I mean, I couldn't say, actually. I couldn't say, because, you don't know. Alternate history tells you just that, whatever. All I could say is that this guy is very impressive. He's very, very impressive. I'm not 100% sure that, I can't necessarily say he's impressive because of his European upbringing, because that's going to give me that European bias as well. So I don't want to say that per se, but he's definitely very impressive, all things considered. And it may be in a Western sense, but in a Western sense, definitely. But I don't know, and I couldn't say from an objective African sense, but actually I could say that if you were to go about from traditional African culture, I can't necessarily speak on how well he's engaged in like traditional or classical African culture. Like from this, I can tell he's really well versed in traditional European culture. I can't necessarily say at this point of the book how engaged he is in African culture. Technically, if I were to be objective, or as objective as you can be from your subjective point of view, if I were looking for a traditional African rulership, I would probably overlook anybody who admitted that they were trying to cater to the Westerners, and the Islamicists and the Christians. I would probably overlook, I'd probably say, hey, actually, that's not what we're looking for from an objective standpoint, from the subjective view of an African traditionalist institution. But notwithstanding that, I would also just say this is really a dynamic and intelligent and amazing individual, and I think Ghana is all the better for this gentleman being there. So I don't want the impression to be that I'm speaking bad about an ancestor so estimable, everything considered. All right. So in addition to them, groups of merchants and traders, lawyers, doctors, politicians, and trade unionists emerged, who, armed with skills and levels of affluence, which were gratifying to the colonial administration, initiated something parallel to the European middle class. there were also certain feudal-minded elements who became imbued with European ideals, either through direct European education or through hobnobbing with the local colonial administration. They gave the impression that they could be relied upon implicitly as repositories of all those staid and conservative virtues indispensable to any exploiter administration. They, as it were, paid the registration fee for membership of a class, which was now associated with social power and authority. Such education as we were all given but put before us right from our infancy, ideals of the metropolitan countries, ideals which could seldom be seen as representing the scheme, the harmony, the progress of African society, the scale and type of economic activity, the idea of accountability of the individual conscience, introduced by the Christian religion, countless other silent influences. These have all made an indelible impression on African society. But neither economic nor political subjugation could be considered as being in tune with the traditional African egalitarian view of man and society. Colonialism had in any case to be done away with. The African Hercules had his club poised ready to smite any new head which the colonialist Hydra may care to put out. With the true African independence regained, however, a new harmony needs to be forged, a harmony that will allow the combined presence of traditional Africa, Islamic Africa, and Euro-Christian Africa, so that this presence is in tune with the original humanist principles underlying African society. Our society is not the old society, but a new society enlarged by Islamic and Euro-Christian influences. A new emergent ideology is therefore required, an ideology which can solidify in a philosophical statement, but at the same time an ideology which will not abandon the original humanist principles of Africa. So again, like I said, from a objective perspective, from a subjective paradigm in regards to Pan-African nationalism per se, and not to say that you want only strictly traditional Africa, but you do not want Islamic Africa and Euro-Christian Africa. Or you shouldn't want those things, because Euro-Christian Africa is Euro-Christian Africa and Islamic Africa have their loyalty outside of Africa, have their loyalty outside Africa, but and on top of that, their philosophies of the brotherhood of man, but brotherhood with people who are not your brothers, people who are there to exploit and harm and harass you. Not to say that traditional Africa has its hands, it's innocent. But, if anything, realistically speaking, if you're trying to develop a new emergent ideology, it might be to fix up traditional Africa, kind of like what people will call reformed Africa or something like that, as opposed to, just trying to hybridize it or mix it with other people. So like the example when I say reformed, you think about an example of that would be like they have these these Jews or whatever, and they have like Reformed Jews and they have like traditional Jews, So and the same with like Christianity, you have your I'm not too sure. Oh, you have your Protestants and you have your Reformed. Like you have like a certain branch of Protestantism. I don't know. I'm not familiar with this stuff. So, don't worry about that. But you understand what I'm saying is that you technically would not be mixing it with other things, but the synthesis in a sense. So, but you kind of expect, this kind of does follow the Hegelian dialectic, the thesis being traditional Africa, the antithesis being Islamic and Euro-Christian Africa, and then the synthesis being all three of them. So you kind of expect somebody who like subscribes to the Hegelian dialectic so rigidly to go about with that. So here he goes into what's going to be the book, which is Consciencism. And this is kind of like why I was kind of a little bit like, I don't know if I'm going to read this, but yeah. All right. Such a philosophical statement will be born out of a crisis of the African conscious confronted with the three strands of present African society. But of course, I also should admit that the Islamics and the Euro-Christians represent 90% of Africa's soi-disant religion. Now, whether or not we're really firmly studied in these religions is a whole other story, and whether or not we can replace it with something else is a whole other story. I believe we can, notwithstanding that, and the reason why I believe we can is because Wazungu clearly demonstrated that he can't replace the religions of African people in a very short period of time. It's not like it's impossible, because if it was impossible, there would not be any Christians or Islamists in Africa. So it's not to say that you can't do that. It's just a matter of So I would say I would personally take a different route, but I understand that if he didn't, I understand if he didn't. And of course, I also want to say this too, that Europe, some people would reason that Europe is being replaced itself from their Christian background into something more humanist and something more scientifically based. And I don't necessarily dismiss the idea of a scientifically based, let's say, if you want to say religion. But I wouldn't necessarily dismiss that in Africa either, only because if you really study traditional African society, you would see that there's actually a really deep scientific basis for their stuff, and that's partly what I intend to write about in my next book. So stay tuned, okay? All right. So such a philosophical statement will be born out of the crisis of the African conscious, confronted with the three strands of present African society. Such a philosophical statement I propose to name philosophical consciencism, for it will give the theoretical basis for an ideology whose aim shall be to obtain the African experience of Islamic and Euro-Christian presence, as well as the experience of the traditional African society, and by gestation employ them for the harmonious growth and development of that society. Every society is placed in nature, and it seeks to influence... Actually, hold on a second. So this is chapter 3, actually, come to think of it. So society and ideology. He says that he revisited this chapter to emphasize the need for armed struggle. So hopefully I'll be able to point that out when it comes up. But so far, I don't see anything to deal with armed struggle. So maybe it's going to come up later. But anyway, so every society is placed, and that's another reason why you should read books quickly when you're reading, so that you could actually appreciate that kind of information. Because if I was just reading this every week, as some might propose I do, I might have forgotten that, because I would have done so many other things in the week. And the only reason why I'm reading it so quickly is because I said I was going to finish it in November. And it's November 4th right now, but if I were to read it every week, I would not. It's 5. There's no 5 Sundays in November. So anyway, every society is placed in nature, and it seeks to influence nature to impose such transformations upon nature as will develop the environment of the society for its better fulfillment. The changed environment in bringing about a better fulfillment of the society thereby alters the society, right? Yeah, society placed in nature is therefore caught in the correlation of transformation with development. This correlation represents the toil of man both as a social being and as an individual. This kind of correlation has achieved expression in various social political theories. For a social political theory has a section which determines the way in which social forces are to be deployed in order to increase the transformations of society. Slavery and feudalism represent social political theories. I actually like what he said earlier, though, about nature. I might actually, put that same kind of thing in my book, where every society is placed in nature, and nature, because that's what I say. I usually say land, right? But realistically speaking, economics is based off of ecology. Ecology is just you and how you deal with the environment. And so yeah, it's really like I said, this is so impressive for a president of a country. This is impressive on its own, but it's even more so impressive because he's the president of a country while he's writing this. It's like he doesn't even have the time, but he does have the time, and he uses the time very expertly. So this is really impressive for an individual. Now, I could admit that the socialists tend to have intellectual leaders. I don't know what Lenin. I know Lenin was kind of on the intellectual end, as well as Mao. I'm not really sure if Mao was super intellectual, but he had his moments. But I'm also not familiar with whether or not Mao was actively intellectual during his reign, in a sense. I know might have been when he was not in his reign, but whether or not he was while he was reigning was a whole different story. So Kwame Nkrumah, though, publishes many books, and this is high caliber. This is not Kwame Nkrumah is just so impressive. He's really impressive in terms of writing, where it's as an author myself, I think there's a lot of times where he just writes things that I couldn't. He could write things better than me. Where for instance, I was gonna write a book on the art of warfare, and I said to myself, look, actually, I think you guys, instead of writing that book, I think you guys should just read Kwame Nkrumah's book on it. You know what I mean? Guerrilla warfare. I read that one, by the way, as well. So just go through my catalog. It might be on one of my playlists, But yeah, I was like, that book right there is so good that it'd be stupid for me to write a book. Like, the only thing I could write in my book is go read his book, So, I mean, although it's socialist kind of, but still, like, it's such a good book that, like, I would overlook that. Anyway, so slavery and feudalism represent social, political theories in which the deployment of forces is not a problematic question. In both slavery and feudalism, workers, the people whose toil transforms nature for the development of society, are disassociated from any in rule. So slavery and feudalism represent social political theories in which the deployment of forces is not a problematic question. So the deployment of forces is not a problematic question, okay? In both slavery and feudalism, workers, the people whose toil transforms nature for the development of society, are disassociated from any say in rule. So in slavery and in feudalism, the workers are not a part of the ruling class. By a vicious division of labor, one class of citizen toils and another reaps what it has not sown. In the slave society, as in the feudal society, the people of the society whose labor transforms nature is not the same as the part which is better fulfilled as a result of this transformation. Right? The people who toil are not the people who gain from that. If by their fruits we shall know them, they must first grow the fruits. In slave and feudal society, the fruit eaters are not the fruit growers. This is the cardinal factor in exploitation, that the section of society whose labor transformed nature is not the same as the section which is better fulfilled as a result of this transformation, right? So this is his take on exploitative communities, which is that the laborers are not necessarily the beneficiaries of their labor, or the absolute beneficiaries of their labor. Now, for slavery, they weren't at all. Then again, this goes back to the social contract thing that we were talking about before, in the sense that, like, if you're in a society, and it's not to say that I agree that you should exploit people, but you when you go to the feudalists, like at least feudalism, like the peasant, you might say, hey, the peasant is doing all the work, and they're growing the fruit, but they're not eating the fruit, right? Instead, the lords are eating the fruit, right? But the reality is that the lords, you have to understand, defend the land. You understand? It's just like the lion, like another example would be like the lion community, right? The male lion does not hunt the gazelle, okay? The male lion does not hunt the gazelle, but he gets a good piece of the meat of the gazelle. Why does he get a good piece of the meat of the gazelle? Because he defends the lion, the lion community from the hyenas, who would attack the women and children for that gazelle as well. So it's really comes about, like, the thing with the socialist argument, and I'm not saying that I'm anti-socialist or nothing. I'm just saying the thing with the socialist argument is that if you look at it strictly from that perspective of, hey, these people didn't grow the fruit, therefore they shouldn't eat the fruit, right? You might miss out on the reality that, well, the reason why the male lion doesn't hunt the gazelle is because if he does hunt the gazelle and he gets winded, then he can't defend against the hyenas. If the real world, the real world is ruled by endurance in a sense. Well, not really ruled by the endurance, but like in the real world, your physical body has a limit of endurance. If, for instance, if a lion is chasing a gazelle, it's a very tasking task. You put all your muscles in sprinting and chasing something to end its life. So it's not like a jog, it's a run. And you're running for extended times, and then your body becomes tired, right? Now, you can just run and bring that food back and so on and so forth, but if you do that, if your body is tired, then you're not going to fight anything at your optimal form. And, whereas a lion at its optimal form can definitely take on hyenas, at its suboptimal form, it likely can't. And that's just, like, not to say that animals understand physics as deeply as you should, but, I'm pretty sure they get something along the lines of, hey, you know what, this thing is tired, let's kill it. Or this thing is injured, let's kill it. Anyway, so, that's just me, explaining that. Yeah, so the lords do, and you might be like, hey, well, the lords are blah, blah, blah. And the lords are, for those of you who might be familiar with Christian language, Lord is what they also call their deity, right? So it was just a weird, like, it's a weird thing to like justify exploitation in a sense. This Christianity thing. This is why I don't even understand why a quote unquote socialist would be like, let's put Christianity here, or let's put Islam here. Islam. For those of you familiar with Armand, he would point out that Islam is the enslaver religion, and I forget what he called Christianity, but basically these religions are not really great people. Either way, the feudal society is like Christianity just kind of is like the cultural justification for the feudal arrangement of obey the Lord, thou shalt not steal from the Lord, and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, so in every non-socialist society, there can be found two strata which correspond to that of the oppressor and the oppressed, the exploiter and the exploited. In all such societies, the essential relation between the two strata is the same as that between masters and slaves, lords and serfs. So again, you could say, hey, look, the Lord actually, defends against other lords, and fights the wars, or leads the wars, or like fights and keeps himself in combat ready position. Now you might be like, well, the master and slave, they don't have the same kind of relationship, but realistically speaking, if you were being objective, you might say that the masters actually trade whatever it is that the slaves take out, And I mean, obviously slavery is a much more exploitative relationship. And of course, you also point out, which is not really a credit to them, but that the master also like feeds and clothes and shelters these enslaved people. Obviously, again, they also when it comes to America, you don't want slavery. Slave as an institution, if you just think about it in terms of chattel slavery, is always going to be much, 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 much worse. But so in the case of chattel slavery, like I said in the other podcast, if you think of it as like landless individuals, like people without land, then you're like, hey, realistically speaking, if somebody's your slave, you actually give them a home and you give them opportunities to socially escalate in an area where they do not have any land, right? Or they don't have any other opportunity. Like if you capture another people, for instance, the people who are at war with you, and then you win the war against them, you don't necessarily in classical societies allow them to continue, just have no repercussions. You take their land, and when you take their land, then you kind of reduce them into slavery in a sense, right? Now, obviously, in the chattel slavery example, it's actually much worse because the life expectancy was so low. It's like 5 years or something. And they were just torturing and harming and hurting human beings. So that's obviously not something that anybody could necessarily defend. But it is. But if you take away from that chattel example and look at it more from an example of, two warring communities, and one of them wins, and as repayment they disarm the men or even take the men and say, hey, look, now you got to live in our community. And serve us until we can recover the payment, which is reparation theory, reparations for your aggressions against us or for your losing against us, whatever. But in that sense, it's still slavery, but it's not it's not chattel slavery, right? But of course, I understand if people hearing that are just recoiling, like, oh gosh, slavery. But that's just the socialization that we have. The Western socialization I can't even say it, right? All right. The Western socialization we have, that just makes it so that anytime we hear the word slave, we associate it with ourselves, and then associated with ourselves, we are just like, no, it's the worst thing on the planet, right? But anyway, in capitalism, which is only a social political theory in which the important aspects of slavery and feudalism are refined, a stratified society is required for its proper functioning. A society is required in which the working class is oppressed by the ruling class, for under capitalism, the portion of society whose labor transforms nature and produces good is not the portion of society which enjoys the fruit of this transformation and productivity, nor is it the whole of society which is also so enhanced. Now again, remember that in capitalism, it's somebody who has the capital, And the thing is this, the worker doesn't have the capital. The laborer doesn't have the capital. And so it only becomes the question of who should benefit from the ownership of the capital, right? And is it the laborer or is it the capitalist? And in a sense, one of the reasons why you would want it to be the capitalist, if you wanted to be the capitalist, and one of the reasons would be that if the owner of the capital has access to more capital, then they can also expand their industry and really employ more people and so on and so forth, right? As to say that like we go back to the example of the pre-colonial, not pre-colonial, sorry, the early Greece or ancient Greece. You have wine presses, right? The owner of the wine press versus the labor of the wine press, right? So the wine press, oh, sorry, it was olive press, but still, let's say the olive press. So, you have a bunch of olives, you put them in this machine, you whatever, and then the machine gives you some olive oil, right? It produces that. Now, if you were to say, hey, you working on my machine, you get most of the money because you work on the machine. I didn't work on it, right? You get most of the money. Then sure, that's okay. But then it really begs the question of, well, then this person just uses his money and they live a good life. That's good for you, sure, right? But in the other example where it's like, hey, that's my property, I'll give you a certain wage, whether it's reasonable or unreasonable, but let's say I give you a reasonable wage for pulling a lever or pouring olives into the machine, right? I'll give you a reasonable wage in comparison to that activity, and then I'll take most of the profit from selling the olives, abroad and all that kind of stuff. When I take that profit, however, I will then buy another wine press or an olive press or a wine press or a different machine in another area and employ other people and give them a reasonable or unreasonable wage and all that kind of stuff. And what that tells you, though, is that now I have this, like I, as a bourgeoisie, in this example, will have provided more opportunities for different people. As to say that you could say, hey, well, look, he's an oppressor. It's an oppressor because they're getting all this money, even though these other people are working for them. But it's like, yeah, but there's also this notion of, well, what is it that capital could do for a community, right? And not to say that I'm making an argument for capitalism. It's more so to just relate to you the realism about not necessarily looking at it from a reduced dichotomic way, or to look at it only from a negative perspective of, hey, you have oppression, they're just oppressed. If somebody is pouring in the olives into the olive press and then they're pulling the lever, they should be rich, not the person who built the machine or the person who bought the machine. The person who pulls a lever should be wealthy because everybody wants olive oil and this person pulled the lever for it, It's like, no, but I mean, like, technically the person who bought the thing or paid for the construction or built it or whatever, like there's so many other things that are involved. And then not just that, like the person who's coordinating how to send the olive to other countries, the person who's coordinating, because you just pull the lever, that doesn't necessarily sell the olive oil, you have to have somebody else who puts it into the stores. And now, is that person who puts it into the stores or who collects it and brings it to the supermarket, is that person supposed to be rich too? Is that like where it's really a thought out question, because this person who brings it to the other place, they're a laborer too, technically. Now, are they entitled to being wealthy? It's all they're doing is, could be a little boy who's like, hey, I collect these olive oil bottles and I bring them to the grocery store, and the grocery store person stocks them. And the person who stocks them, are they supposed to be the wealthy person from the, where does it, how do you justify this? And so, it's really a complicated question, and it shouldn't just be reduced to, well, the person who pulled the lever, or the person who stocked the ingredients, or the person who did this, or the person who did that is being exploited, But, again, like the thing with the socialists or the Marxists is that it does become an automatic statement of exploitation. So, we'll see. This might indeed be termed a contradiction. It is a social contradiction insofar as it is contrary to genuine principles of social equality and social justice. It is also a economic contradiction insofar as the contrary to a harmonious and unlimited economic development. Right? So capitalism is a development by refinement from feudalism, just as feudalism is a development by refinement from slavery. So this is a Hegelian... This is how I think Marx summarizes European society. Right? I'm going to have to tell my kid to be quiet. Hold on a second. All right, so actually I hope the audio is coming out well. I just realized that this meter is all the way up. So hopefully it's coming out well. All right, so capitalism is a development by refinement from feudalism, just as feudalism is a development by refinement from slavery. The essence of reform is to combine the continuity of fundamental principles with a tactical change in the manner of expression of the fundamental principle. The essence of reform is to combine a continuity of fundamental principle with a tactical change in the manner of expression of the fundamental principle. So he's like, what reform is that you have the same fundamental principle in place, but there's a different tactic, like we said, principle versus program. And so fundamentally, he's saying capitalism is feudalism and feudalism is slavery, but tactically they're different things. In slavery, the feudalists, like in slavery, you might not be paid, and so on and so forth. In feudalism, you might have your own piece of land, and in capitalism, you might have your own piece of land and you might get paid. But fundamentally, it's all just slavery, which is not really unreasonable to say. But it's you don't want to. You want to take it with a grain of salt, right? All right. So the essence of reform is to combine the continuity of. Reform is not a change in the thought, but one in its manner of expression. Not a change in what is said, but one in idiom. In capitalism, feudalism suffers, or rather enjoys a reform, and the fundamental principle of feudalism merely strikes a new level of subtlety. In slavery, it is thought that exploitation, the alienation of the fruits of the labor of others, requires a certain degree of political and forcible subjection. In feudalism, it is thought that a lesser degree of the same kind of subjection is adequate to the same purpose. In capitalism, it is thought that a still lesser degree is adequate. In this way, psychological irritants to revolution are appeased, and exploitation finds a new lease of life until the people should discover the opposition between reform and revolution. So he's like, yeah, so pretty fundamentally, it's like, slavery, you might be, you might be forced. Feudalism, you might be forced less. Capitalism, you might be forced even less. But ultimately, you have to know the difference between reform and revolution. That's to say that you shouldn't want to be a slave regardless of whatever. Now, of course, again, I pointed out it's a little bit more complicated, but still, it's just like a socialist document, so you understand. So in this way, capitalism continues with its characteristic pompous plans for niggardly reforms, while it coerces one section of a society somehow into making itself available to another section, which battens on it. Plan for niggardly reforms, while it coerces one section of a society somehow into making itself available to another section. All right, so that development which capitalism marks over slavery and feudalism consists as much in the method by means of which labor is coerced in the modes of production. Capitalism is but the gentleman's method of slavery, right? So he's like, you're coerced differently. Like, you're not coerced with a whip, per se, and that's more so chattel slavery, but you're not coerced with a whip as much as you are coerced with money, right? But again, remember, this is chattel slavery. So, one of the things that people are going to say is that, Africa had its own slavery, and you don't want it to use that form of slavery. Like, that's not form. Like, that's not the same type of slavery. Like I said, it's more so, what do you do when you conquer another land? Or what do you do when you win a war against men? Do you leave them alone? Do you kill them? Or do you work them to recover the losses that might have been endured based off of that war? As to say, realistically speaking, wars might have been such the case that, like, let's say you have a real empire fighting another real empire or something like that, or a real kingdom fighting another real kingdom. One might burn a whole village. One might, bomb people. One might kill people. One might kill a politician or a driver or a trader or something, so on and so forth. And then after that, you say, look, we have this human labor need now. After war, we have this human labor need, and you were the cause of it. You guys in your fighting was the cause of it. And so, because of that, right, we're going to work you to repay or to recover the losses that we otherwise had because we won the war. We won the war. And we're going to take that land of yours so that we can expand and put our people there, but we won the war, ultimately. And, it's a question of, well, how ethical the war is. And, of course, there's also the question of, and there's also the realization that a lot of times, as Chancellor William points out, we didn't really have wars that were that violent or that, that catastrophic. But at the same time, if you do battle with other people, one of the things about reparations usually goes to the winner of a war. And the reason why it does is so that the war isn't fought again. Because if you do not have any sort of negative repercussions for the loser of the war, then they could always just fight the war the next year. You know what I mean? Whereas if you have a negative repercussion, then not only can you defend yourself against other opponents in case, you were weakened by the war yourself, but you also won't be finding that same loser again. Because now they are set back, you set them back, and you set yourself forward from being set back from the war itself. You understand? Because a war costs both parties, right? Now here, like give it this way: you have three kingdoms that are of equal power. Two of them fight. The two that fight are weakened. Okay. Now the third one is relatively stronger for it, or really stronger than them because it was the strongest than before they fought. Okay. And so if the two of them fight and get weaker, then the one that didn't fight is now stronger than both of them. That means that now the stronger one, the third one who didn't fight, can fight either one of the other two. And that's going to be a problem for the two of them, even for the one who won. So what you would do if there was a sort of three situation is you would have the let's say A, B, and C. A and B fight, and C is now the strongest of the three. You would let's say B wins against A. What B would do is B would impose reparations on A, and then A would become much more weak, right? And then B would become stronger, and in B becoming stronger, now if it's stronger than C, then either it can fight C or it will not be fought with from C. You know? And A, however, in order for A to be weaker, part of that is that you might take some of the people, and then you might call that slavery. And I don't know why I'm going so depth in slavery. I know it's like, what the crap? But you get what I'm saying. But like I said, don't mistake that with the same thing of chattel slavery, which was just a horrible, just a totally different institution, as well as the Islamic version of slavery. These are different versions of slavery from what would be, if you would, traditional, a more traditional form of not necessarily slavery per se, but it is something that people tend to call slavery, because they don't understand that you don't just kill off, like you don't have B and A fighting and then B just kills everybody in A. You know what I'm saying? Because that would be the more unethical thing. But on the other hand, you don't just leave A alone and be like, well, now I'm weaker and A is weaker, and then we're just like if A wants to exact revenge, it can exact it at any time because we're both weaker, and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, so let's say indeed the standard rules of capitalism today is to imitate some of the proposals of socialism. So this is what you call what they call social democracies, like Canada and some parts of Western Europe or Northern Europe, right? So indeed, the standard rules of capitalism, and actually, I want to point out that I did read Lenin to you guys as well. So to look into that document I did where Lenin is talking about this kind of stuff, and he's like, yeah, you gotta watch out for social democrats. You gotta watch out for social democrats because that's going to stop the democratic socialism in a sense. Right, it's going to stop the socialism because you have the social democrats. All right, so indeed, the standard rules of capitalism today is to imitate some of the proposals of socialism and turn its imitation to its own use. Running with the hare and hunting with the hounds is much more than a pastime to capitalism. It is a hub of complete strategy. In socialism, we seek an increase in levels of production in order solely that the people by whose exertion production is possible shall raise their standard of living and attain a new consciousness and level of life. Capitalism does this too, but not for the same purpose. Increased productivity under capitalism does indeed lead to a rise in standard of living, but when the proportional distribution of value between exploited and exploiter is kept constant, then any increase in levels of production must mean a greater quantity, but not proportion, of value accruing to the exploited. Capitalism thus discovers a new way of seeming to implement reform, which generally avoiding it, it creates the welfare state. So Kwame Nkrumah does talk about this a lot. In his neocolonialism book, he talks about the welfare state as well. And that book is one of the books that I gave somebody in Ghana. It was pretty nice of me. Although I shouldn't took my own one, but I was just like, look, I just ate breakfast, but I'm still, like I've been standing for hours every day now. All right, so whereas capitalism is a development by refinement from slavery and feudalism, socialism does not contain the fundamental ingredient of capitalism, the principle of exploitation. Socialism stands for the negation of that very principle wherein capitalism has it being lives and thrives, that principle which links capitalism with slavery and feudalism. Now, I want to say this too. I just want to backtrack. When I talk about Africanist philosophy versus Eurasianist philosophy, I point out that Eurasianists are about exploitation. That's their way, whereas our way would be reciprocity. And actually, that's also what I think I gleaned that from Armand. So Armand is saying their way is, he said our way is reciprocity, ma'at, so on and so forth. And then I think he might say their way is exploitation, but if he doesn't, that's what I articulate. Let's say that their way is exploitation, right? So it's just interesting because he's like, hey, feudalism, slavery, and capitalism. And it's like, no, that's really just what Wazungu does, you know? But anyway, if one seeks the social political ancestors of socialism, one must go to communalism. Socialism has characteristics in common with communalism. Just as capitalism is linked with feudalism and slavery, in socialism, the principle underlying communalism are given expression in modern circumstances. Thus, whereas communalism is an untechnical society, can be laissez-faire. He's like communalism in an untechnical society. So untechnical, remember, technical is like basically like industry, right? So he's like, in a technical society can be laissez-faire, as a, everybody does whatever they want. In a technical society where sophisticated means of production are at hand, if the underlying principles of communalism are not given centralized and correlated expression, class cleavages arise, which are the result of economic disparities and accompanying political inequalities. So again, the capital example could be like the wine press, like I just pointed out earlier, the oil press. You have somebody who owns the oil press. If it's not collectively owned, right, then it's going to lead to a class stratification or class cleavage, because the worker and the owner are not going to receive the same wages, or they shouldn't see the same wages, right? Because they're not doing the same work. Now, one person is going to say, hey, look, I'm the owner. Another person is going to say, hey, look, I'm the worker. And then, however that goes. But what he's saying is essentially that in a non-technical society where there's no wine presses, no oil press, and all that kind of stuff, it doesn't matter, right? It's like, the only thing that's there is like a tree, and nobody owns a tree per se. But when it comes to this more technical thing, then you have these, you can go either way. And what he's saying is that the West went the way of capitalism. So let's just read this with that understanding in mind. Socialism's characteristic, common with so on and so forth. In socialism, the principle underlying communalism are given expression in modern circumstances. Thus, so he's like, in socialism, principles underlying communalism are given expression in modern circumstances, i.e., socialism is the technical communalism, right? And this is why also you want to say that, this is why you don't say that Africans had socialist countries, because they didn't have the technical countries in that same degree, or in that particular degree. This is like a really fundamental aspect, because when you understand the socialist wants the technical community, right, you realize that, and like you have to say to yourself too that you technically as well, you on the internet want the technical society as well. Now you come into the paradigm of, well, how do we make a technical society that's still just? For those of you who don't know, I did have a book called Zubiri and the Moons of Ah, and I do kind of touch on a technical society that is not necessarily capitalist and not necessarily socialist. So definitely check that out when you can. It's a very short book. Like you could read it in shorter time than I read this. You could literally read it in like 2 hours or whatever, or even like less maybe. But it touches on that kind of an economy as well. So thus, whereas communalism in an untechnical society can be laissez-faire, in a technical society where sophisticated means of production are at hand, if the underlying principle of communalism are not given centralized and correlated expression, class cleavage arise, which are the result of economic disparities and accompanying political inequalities. Socialism, therefore, can be and is the defense of the principle of communalism in a modern setting. Socialism is a form of social organization which, guided by the principles underlying communism, adopts procedures and measures made necessary by demographic and technological developments. So that's why I tell you guys about black people shouldn't even talk about being socialists, because they don't have capital, they don't have the technology. They're literally just living inside of a capitalist communities, and talking about, well, I'm socialist, and it's like, no, you're not, because socialism is about what do you do with capital? And if you don't have capital, if you're not producing anything, then you're not socialist and you're not capitalist. You're just a victim of one of them. These considerations throw great light on the bearing of revolution and reform on socialism. The passage from the ancestral line of slavery via feudalism and capitalism to socialism can only lie through revolution. It cannot lie through reform. For in reform, fundamental principles are held constant and the details of their expression modified. In the words of Marx, it leaves the pillars of the building intact. Indeed, sometimes reform itself may be initiated by the necessities of preserving identical fundamental principles. Reform is a tactic of self-preservation. Revolution is thus an indispensable avenue to socialism. So this is the idea, this is why people like Marxism, is that, it's about this revolution. It's this idea that, hey, look, capitalism fundamentally is about exploitation. And you cannot have a community that's not fundamentally about exploitation from reform. You have to do it through revolution, right? You have to do it through armed struggle, you have to do it through violence. And hopefully he's going to get into that soon. So revolution is thus indispensable avenue to socialism, where the antecedent social political structure is animated by principles which are a negation of those of socialism, as in the capitalist structure. Revolution. All right, so where the antecedent social political structure is animated by principles which are a negation of those of socialism, as in the capitalist structure. So he's like, revolution for socialism comes about because capitalism is negates socialism, right? And therefore also in a colonial structure, for a colonial structure is essentially ancillary to capitalism. Indeed, I distinguish between two colonialisms, between a domestic one and an external one. Capitalism at home is domestic colonialism, right? So there are two different types of colonialism to this individual, to Nkrumah. That is, capitalism is just the domestic colonialism, whereas imperialism probably, he's going to say imperialism probably, is the external form of colonialism, right? But because or just colonialism, right? But because the spirit of communalism still exists to some extent in societies with a communist past, socialism and communism are not in the strict sense of the word revolutionary creeds. They may be described as restatements in contemporary idioms of the principles underlying communalism. On the other hand, in societies with no history of communalism, the creeds of socialism and communism are fully revolutionary, and the passage to socialism must be guided by the principles of scientific socialism. So, scientific socialism, for those who don't know, is Marxism, right? The nature and cause of the conflict between the ruling class and exploitative class is influenced by the development of productive forces, that is, changes in technology, the economic relations which these forces condition. Where am I? Oh, and the ideologies that reflect the properties and psychology of the people living in that society. The basis of a social revolution is created when these class struggles within a given society has resulted in mass consent and mass desire for positive action to change or transform that society. It is then the foundation is laid for the highest form of political action when a revolution attains its excellence and workers and peasants succeed in overthrowing all other classes. Actually, I think I might have to reread that. I'm getting distracted because I know that. Okay, I'm just like, when is this going to end? No, I'm thinking actually, this next chapter is longer, and I don't really want. I don't know how freaking long I could have this series. All right, so let's go into this because this is actually really important about socialism and communism. I'm thinking about everybody who's listening. I appreciate you guys for listening. Realistically speaking, I appreciate you for listening because, as you can see, this is pretty labor intensive. This is actually unpaid labor. We talk about slavery. We don't like the slavery. We all talk about, oh yeah, why you defend slavery, bruh? I'm literally doing unpaid labor. Come on. I could talk about it, right? You know what I'm saying? But it's not me defending it, you defending it. You know what I'm saying? You're not paying me. I ain't the professor. All right, so the nature and cause of the conflict, but what's important is the technology aspect. So, you have to realize that realistically speaking, people do want the technology of the West. And so how you use that technology of the West, how you do that is the question of what's the economic system going to be, right? But anyway, the nature and cause of the conflict between the ruling class and the exploited class is influenced by the development of productive forces, that is, changes in technology, the economic relation which they force condition, and the ideologies that reflect the property and psychology of the people living in a society. The basis of socialist revolution is created when the class struggle within a given society has resulted in mass consent and mass desire for positive action to change or transform the society. It is then the foundation is laid in the highest form of political action when a revolution attains its excellence and workers and peasants succeed in overthrowing all of the classes. So this idea here, and this is why it's kind of difficult for the Western world to go through these revolutions now, is because they're hip to it, Like Marx was like, hey, if the workers, and then so the West was kind of like, oh, well, what about we just put the workers in India? Then they're not going to be able to fight us, right? But if they do fight us, they're not going to be able to fight us because we're not in India, right? A bunch of irate Indians are going to probably at best fight the local bourgeoisie. They're not necessarily going to fight the British bourgeoisie because the British bourgeoisie are in across the ocean, and the working class is not going to be able to reach across the ocean, right? So it's a smarter way to keep your power and your in check. Either way, why do I say all this? Yeah. So the idea here is that you would have the workers and peasants overthrow the ruling class, right? The bourgeoisie, and then take over their machinery and form a dictatorship on that basis, right? Anyway, so I've explained how society's desire to transform nature reflects itself in different sociopolitical theories. I will now, to suggest how the same desire reflects itself in philosophy, I wish now to suggest how the same desire reflects itself in philosophy. Just as sociopolitical theories, to the extent that they deploy forces for the harnessing and development of nature, fall into two lots, so do philosophies. From this standpoint, the two real sociopolitical alternatives facing society are either that one section should produce and another section batten thereon, or that all sections should produce and all sections should be fulfilled by the value created by labor. So there's two different philosophies. It says either one side produces, another produces, and another, gets fat off of it, I guess. I don't know what batten means, honestly. But, or it's like everybody produces and everybody is fulfilled by that value created by the labor. Interesting, okay? So again, this is not really too realistic. Again, like I said, you want to go into the Kemet model, and realistically speaking, you have these hierarchies where there's going to be some people who do not produce. You know, like even even when we talk about just like businesses in general, like you're working in a business, you might not be a part of the productive class of that business at this moment. You might be a part of the distribution class, maybe a part of the marketing class. These are different occupations within the same sort of position, like the same sort of business, and like these are important positions, but they're not necessarily the productive positions. And so the question becomes, and the thing is that the wealth is actually created from these other parts, this distribute. Like again, one of the main things you want to remember is that trade is the hallmark of wealth, right? Trade is where wealth comes from, right? Producing things is not trading things. I could grow a bunch of, I could have 1,000 sheep, but if I do not trade any of the sheep, I won't have any money per se. Now I would have wealth if you measure wealth by sheep, but I would not have money, and I won't have access to other resources unless I actually trade. Like I won't be able to get a television, just because I have 1,000 sheep. I'd have to trade the sheep for something, and then trade so on and so forth in order to get that television. So it's just realistically speaking, it's not just the productive forces. Like it's not just being productive that creates wealth. Like wealth is really created from trade. And you don't have to actually produce anything to create wealth through trade. Like I could easily, like for instance, somebody says, "Hey, I need some water." And I say, "Look, I'll give you my water bottle for $10." Right? Not to say that I would do that, but just saying if I were to do that, I bought it for $1 or whatever. Or even like if you're being realistic, a lot of people do buy water. Like one of the things that you might find is that you can buy you go into the hood, and somebody's like, "Hey, I could sell you water for $1." Right? And that's a good deal. That's how much it costs everywhere. You know what I mean? Like a liter of water is pretty much $1. Even when you go into Ghana, it's like a liter of water is $1, right? Or a CD or whatever, right? That's it. But then they don't get the dollar. They don't get the water for $1. You know what I'm saying? They get the water for like 16 cents. They get the water for 20 cents or even 50 cents or even 75 cents. Who cares? But they get the water for much cheaper than they're selling the water. And that's what would create that profit. That's what would create the wealth. Not so much the production of water or the production of the water bottle. That's not that people produce water, but not cleaning the water or filtering the water. That's not what creates the wealth. So just a concept for you guys to come along with, because one of the things about reading a lot of these books is that you're not going to hear from anybody else, and so you might hear from the book and it's going to be a good thing, but look, if you didn't want to hear anything else, you should have just read the book. You know what I mean? Like if you don't want to hear explanations of the book, you should have just read the damn book. Anyway, so in the same way, there are two real philosophical alternatives. These alternatives coincide with idealism and materialism. In the preceding chapter, I explained how idealism was connected with a tiered society, how through its mode of explaining nature and social phenomena by reference to spirit, idealism favored a class structure of a horizontal sort in which one class sat upon the neck of another. I also explained there how materialism, on the other hand, was connected with a humanist organization, how though through its being monistic and its referring all natural processes to matter and its laws, it inspired an egalitarian organization of society. The unity and fundamental identity of nature suggests the unity and fundamental identity of man in society. Idealism favors an oligarchy. Materialism favors an egalitarianism. Individuals have both idealist and materialist tendencies in them. So have societies both idealist and materialist streaks. But these streaks do not exist in equipoise. They are connected by a conflict in which now one streak predominates, now the other. By reason of the connection of idealism with an oligarchy and of materialism with an egalitarianism, the opposition of idealism and materialism in the same society is paralleled by the opposition of conservative and progressive forces on the social level. When in the dialectical opposition of capitalism to socialism, the former for a time becomes triumphant, social progress is not thereby altogether arrested, though it is seriously attenuated, right? And it becomes triumphant. When in the opposition, capitalism is triumphant to socialism, social progress is not together arrested, but is seriously attenuated. But since it is not arrested, it is hardly cause for wonder that the workers of today, in many respects, enjoy better circumstances of life than even a good many feudal lords of the past. To confess to the degree of progress is not to say, however, that capitalism has been without its shanty towns and slums, its captive workers languishing and finally dying in public squares because of hunger, cold, and disease. So he's pointing out the common thing, which is that realistically speaking, if you were in America, you might enjoy quite a bit of wealth. You can as an individual sometimes. Actually, this is a conversation. Actually, so shout out to Lero. Lero was one of the people who told me to read this book. Hopefully, she reached this. Hopefully, she made it this far in the podcast, and I'm not just talking to myself. And part of the reason why you're inspired to even explain everything is because people ask you to explain everything. So Lero is one of them. But Lero was having this conversation with this individual from Nigeria, where he was like, "I would rather be homeless in America than living well-to-do in Nigeria or something like that, right?" And Lero was like, "No, look, I've experienced." Well, I shouldn't say this. She said this. Well, I guess she said it in public, so it's okay. But she's like, yeah, she's experienced like some sort of version of homelessness or whatever, and it's not good. Like sleeping outside. I don't know if she did the sleeping outside in the cardboard thing, but like it's not as good. It's not better than being inside of another nation. Now, some people will argue that if that nation is not functional, then it is probably better. But this is kind of what Kwame Nkrumah was pointing out as well. He's saying, look, yeah, there's definitely this. There's a great many workers of today who are enjoying life even better than feudal lords of the past or even feudal lords in other parts of the world. And this is something that Adam Smith would reason back in 17-something, or when he wrote his book, right? 1776, I think, right? Or 1792 or something like that. But so even when he's reasoning, he's writing his book, he's saying, hey, look, there's a good life that you can enjoy from a technical society, even better than the life you would enjoy from a non-technical society, right? Even if you were rich in that non-technical society. That said, what Kwame Nkrumah at least is pointing out, or just like what Lero was pointing out, was that there's also these shanty towns and slums, and there's unemployment, and there's poverty, and there's hunger, and there's cold, and there's disease, notwithstanding the abundance that many other people are enjoying. So some people will reason to you, hey, you know what, this life here in America is actually pretty good, and it's pretty good for a lot of black folk too. Like I think 50% of black folk are middle class, whereas another 50% might be in the slums in a sense, but or the ghetto, if you will. But that's neither here nor there. All right, so the question is not whether there has been a discernible progress under capitalism, but rather whether that progress is admitted can be said to be adequate, right? Right. And so it's not the question of, so he's like, it's not a question of whether there's a discernible progress under capitalism, but whether that progress is admitted can be said to be adequate, whether it's an adequate amount of progress. Here we discern one of capitalism's deadly sins. Under this social political system, man's materialist approach to nature loses its bearings. It sheds its humanist stimulus under the impulse of the profit motive. If happiness is defined in the kind of society, then happiness becomes that feeling which an individual derives from a given economic, political, and cultural context, that he is in a position to make good his aspirations. Since capitalist development is unfortunately a process in which a rapaciously oligarchy A rapacious oligarchy is pitted against an exploited mass. Happiness, according to this definition, is denied to many. The achievement of the capitalist oligarchy defines new limits of what is attainable by the individual and thereby push outward the frontiers of legitimate aspirations. But capitalism is a system in which this limiting aspirations are by definition denied to the people and only reserved for a few. So he's like, look, there's the issue with capitalism is fundamental. It's not humanist. Like the humanist stimulus is not there, and it's instead it's about this profit motive and what is happiness as defined in the community, right? Is actually limited to only a reserved few, right? Yeah, so the exploited masses are denied the happiness, but the oligarchy itself, which can obviously be penetrated by the masses, but it's ultimately that these sort of good things are pretty limited in comparison. Now that does beg the question of, well, I'll give you this. There are magazines catering towards like the super wealthy, as to say that there are things that are enjoyable in this capitalist country that you will not experience per chance. Like say you personally. Now maybe your favorite rapper or your favorite musician, your favorite entertainer may, maybe not. But like for instance, I saw like a self-driving car that starts off with like no steering wheel or whatever. It's just weird, right? Or like a pop-out stereo, like all these kind of things that you will not experience. Now the question is, well, should you even experience it, or should anybody experience those things? Those are the questions. But yeah, it's like the yacht experience or even some beaches or what have you, or vacations or trips or this kind of stuff, all that kind of stuff. That's not going to be something that's given to everybody. Now, is that like a critique? I don't know per se. I don't know if that's really a critique. Although I could admit that going on vacation was a pretty damn good experience, and a lot of people do not go on vacations. So even in America, a lot of people don't go on vacations, but in Africa, it was like 99% of the people you meet were like, I never even left Ghana. So the evil of capitalism consists in its alienation of the fruit of labor from those who the toil of their body, those who with the toil of their body and the sweat of their brow produce this fruit. This aspect of capitalism makes it irreconcilable with those basic principles which animate the traditional African society. Capitalism is unjust, and in our newly independent countries, it is not only too complicated to be workable, it is also alien. Under socialism, however, the study and mastery of nature has a humanist impulse and is directed not towards a profiteering accomplishment, but the affording of ever-increasing satisfaction from the material and spiritual needs of the greatest number. Ideas of the transformation and development insofar as they relate to the purpose of society as a whole and not to an oligarch purpose are, properly speaking, appropriate to socialism. Now, I want to say this. I'm not 100% sure. The way I was turning out, because the next chapter is on Consciencism, I'm kind of like, I know it's only one paragraph, 2 paragraphs, I just read it, but I'm kind of like, is he going to talk about Consciencism, or is he going to say socialism, and is Consciencism a variety of socialism? That's the question. But, that's just something you want to, like, realistically, if you're reading it, you just don't even stop to ask yourself. But you see he's kind of railing against capitalism, naturally, and all that kind of stuff. On the philosophical level, too, it is the materialism, not idealism, that in one form or another will give the firmest conceptual basis to the restitution of Africa's egalitarian and humanist principles. Idealism breeds an oligarchy, and its social implication, as drawn out in my second chapter, is obnoxious to African society. It is materialism with its monistic and naturalistic account of nature, which will balk arbitrariness, inequality, and injustice. How materialism suggests a social philosophy, I have explained in my second chapter. In sum, the restitution of Africa's humanist and egalitarian principles of society requires socialism, and it is materialism that ensures the only effective transformation of nature, and socialism that derives the highest development from this transformation. So I thought he was going to go into Consciencism really quickly. I would be like, what? But he didn't. So the next chapter is on Consciencism. It seems pretty good. Yeah, like I said, he's making these arguments against capitalism, and capitalism is like this. But of course, you remember that social stratification comes about, has its merits. It's not just a demerit. Socialism, with its lack of social stratifications, is not necessarily as clear how that works out. What happens inside of, for instance, the Soviet Union nothing against the Soviet Union, but the like Soviet Union. I know like I told you right. I know the national anthem for the Soviet Union. United forever. Okay, right. So I know it, right? But but the point is that notwithstanding, I know it in English, obviously. That Paul Robeson sings it. But the thing about that is that the way how socialism operated as opposed to communism, which was the aftermath of it, was that they had Soviet blocs. They had workers' councils. They understood that you still had to have a bureaucracy as the people were transitioning into a more free and a more free and liberal society in a sense. But whether they would reach that is a whole other story. Because one of the things that I actually would reason is that it's possible that in nature that there's a natural inclination for Wazungu to be a part of exploitative societies, and because of that, like they probably cannot achieve a socialism at all. Now, obviously, you're going to be like, well, we're talking about Africa now, so maybe that's not going to be the case. Maybe that's not going to be a limitation, but it's really going to be interesting. Hopefully, when he talks about consciencism, I expect that he's going to point out that Marx has said that religion is the opiate of the masses, and that realistically speaking, you do not want to maintain religions in the synthesis from this revolutionary ideology. So we're going to see how he tackles that in Consciencism. But until next time, maybe not next week, but until next time, I've enjoyed your time. I appreciate you spending your time with me, and I'll hear from you later. Make sure you subscribe, make sure you like, make sure you share the video, and all that kind of jazz. But other than that, Shamiam Hotep, Anku Jas and Neb Neb, Amen, Ma'at, Duanecher.